Ever wonder why certain patterns keep repeating in our world, or why some conflicts seem to have no end? It's not just chance. Join me as we uncover 100 historical narratives you've never heard of, but which are profoundly influencing every aspect of our contemporary lives. Get ready to connect the dots you never knew existed. Let's start with Level 1. Imagine yourself standing before a quiet stone pillar, its surface carefully carved more than 2,000 years ago. The letters are simple, yet they carry the voice of Emperor Ashoka, ruler of the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE. After years of conquest, Ashoka turned away from violence and sought another path, one shaped by compassion, justice, and the rhythm of peace. These pillars and rock faces became his messengers, spread across the land, whispering not of war, but of kindness toward all living beings. Life in his empire was vast and varied. Farmers rose before dawn, their days filled with the steady work of tending crops, while traders moved between cities heavy with spices, textiles, and stories from faraway lands. Above them stood the emperor, no longer a conqueror but a guide, urging harmony in homes, in villages, even in the treatment of animals. Imagine yourself pausing in that ancient world, hearing the faint tapping of chisels as masons etched words that would outlast dynasties. The edicts were not simply rules, they were reminders of an ideal. They spoke of caring for prisoners, of respecting different faiths, of planting trees along roads to shade weary travelers. In them, governance became more than control, it became moral responsibility. Even centuries later, fragments of these stones remain, their surfaces worn but their message intact. When you read them, you sense the stillness of a ruler who chose mercy after violence, who tried to guide an empire with gentleness rather than fear. Today, scholars trace echoes of these words in the very language of governance, in concepts of tolerance and justice that shape societies. Though the stones stand silent now, they invite you to imagine a time when an emperor's voice was carried not by armies, but by carved lines in stone, lines that continue to murmur across the centuries, steady as the passing of time itself. Imagine yourself walking along the narrow streets of Timbuktu centuries ago, where the desert winds brushed against walls of mud-brick mosques and courtyards shaded by acacia trees. Hidden inside quiet rooms were treasures unlike gold or silver, thousands of manuscripts written in graceful Arabic script, their pages thick with the scent of parchment and ink. They recorded medicine that blended herbal cures with careful observation, astronomy that mapped the movements of stars across the desert sky, and records of trade routes that stretched far beyond the Sahara, linking West Africa to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. These texts were not simply academic exercises. They were woven into the rhythm of daily life, guiding how communities healed, navigated, and prospered. Picture a scholar seated in low light, reciting passages to a circle of students. The words carried lessons both practical and philosophical, merging scientific reasoning with faith. In these manuscripts, you find recipes for healing fevers, instructions for calculating eclipses, and contracts that reveal how goods moved from salt mines to distant ports. To the outside world, Africa was often imagined as silent or forgotten, yet here, knowledge flourished quietly, passed down with patient care. Centuries later, when threats of conflict and shifting empires endangered these libraries, families hid the manuscripts inside wooden chests, buried beneath sand or tucked away in hidden walls. They survived not by accident, but by devotion. Imagine yourself lifting a fragile page today, the ink still legible, carrying echoes of conversations long faded. The manuscripts remind us that wisdom often lies outside the spotlight, preserved in silence, waiting to be rediscovered. And in that rediscovery, the global story of knowledge becomes richer, revealing roots that stretch deep into the Sahel. Picture the northern seas of Europe in the 14th century. Imagine yourself walking through a bustling port where the air is thick with the brine of the Baltic, mixed with the spice of dried fish, beeswax, and cloth. Wooden ships creak at their moorings, their sails furled, while merchants speak in a mix of German, Danish, and Dutch. This was the world of the Hanseatic League, a confederation of towns and traders who quietly wove together one of the first great trade webs in history. Their network stretched from London to Novgorod, from Bergen to Lübeck, binding distant shores in an invisible current of goods, agreements, and shared rules. Daily life for these merchants was not marked by grandeur, but by routine discipline. They rose with the tide, negotiated prices in drafty warehouses, and recorded transactions on rough parchment. In London's Steelyard or Novgorod's trading posts, their communities created enclaves with their own laws, churches, and guild halls. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by seasons. Grain from Prussia in the summer, salted herring from Scandinavia in the autumn, and furs from the Russian forests in the icy months. Imagine the steady repetition of loading barrels, tallying ledgers, and sharing cautious meals with men who knew their fortunes could be lost to one bad storm. Yet beneath these practical exchanges lay something larger. The League introduced contracts, collective security agreements, and dispute resolution systems that foreshadowed the mechanisms of modern multinational corporations. Their web was not just about goods, but about rules, rules that turned fragile voyages into predictable commerce. At its height, nearly 200 towns adhered to this system, their prosperity tied together by mutual trust and cautious ambition. Today, when you think of container ships crossing oceans or corporations spanning continents, you are looking at an echo of what these medieval merchants began. The Hanseatic League has faded from memory, its warehouses now museums and its guild halls silent. But its logic, the idea that scattered communities could cooperate for mutual profit across borders, remains a quiet ancestor of global trade. Imagine yourself standing in the dust of Mesopotamia nearly 4,000 years ago. The air is heavy with the scent of clay, where tablets lie drying in the sun. These tablets hold something extraordinary. The Code of Ur-Nammu, a set of laws carved long before Hammurabi's famous code. Attributed to King Ur-Nammu of Ur, around 2100 BCE, it is considered the world's oldest surviving legal code, a fragile but powerful thread reaching from the ancient city-states of Sumer into the legal frameworks of today. Life in this world was measured by fields of barley, flocks of sheep, and crowded marketplaces. To keep order, the code offered not just punishment, but proportion. If a man caused injury, the penalty was often a fine, measured in silver, rather than a brutal retribution. Theft, false accusations, and even marital disputes were addressed with rules that sought to balance harm with consequence. It was not equality as we imagine it today, but it carried an early vision of fairness, predictable justice instead of unchecked vengeance. Archaeologists who pieced together these clay fragments found a tone that feels unexpectedly humane. Where later codes often called for death, Ur-Nammu's preferred compensation. A broken bone or a damaged eye was met with a fine, a recognition that human harm could be acknowledged without endless cycles of violence. In a society of farmers, craftsmen, and priests, such laws created a rhythm of stability, allowing communities to function without constant fear of feud. As you picture those ancient streets, narrow, sun-baked, and alive with traders calling out their wares, you might sense how these laws quietly structured daily life. They were more than decrees from a distant king. They became part of the rhythm of ordinary existence. Even now, across centuries, the whispers of Ur-Nammu's justice can still be heard in the idea that laws should protect the weak, restrain the powerful, and give shape to fairness in human society. Imagine a landscape of rolling Bohemian hills in the early 15th century, villages clustered around wooden churches, fields thick with rye and barley. Life here was shaped by rhythms of labor and faith, yet also unsettled by whispers of reform and rebellion. Into this world stepped Jan Žižka, a man who would rise from obscurity to command armies in ways Europe had never seen. Born into the lesser nobility, Žižka fought as a mercenary long before he became a symbol. His body bore scars of countless battles, and eventually, even his sight failed him, first in one eye, then in both. Yet blindness did not end his career. Instead, it seemed to sharpen his reliance on hearing, memory, and the instincts of discipline. Where others relied on sight, he relied on preparation and trust. At the heart of his Hussite revolution lay an unexpected tool, the war wagon. Imagine heavy carts fortified with wooden planks and iron fittings, chained into circles across open fields. Farmers, artisans, and townspeople sheltered behind them, wielding crossbows, flails, and early firearms. Against the armored cavalry of Europe's princes, this was a startling reversal. Horses balked at the barriers, knights found themselves trapped, and infantry advancing across rough ground faced withering fire from behind movable walls. Yet Žižka's genius was not only in engineering. He organized common people into disciplined units, training them in drills that echoed like rituals. What might have seemed a rabble became a force capable of defeating crusader armies again and again. His tactics foreshadowed the principles of modern guerrilla warfare: mobility, terrain advantage, and the blending of ordinary life with organized resistance. Even after his death, the Hussite spirit lingered. Villagers returned to their fields, but memory of wagon forts and sudden victories remained. In Žižka's story, you glimpse how innovation born from necessity can ripple through centuries, reshaping how people resist power and imagine freedom. Imagine yourself aboard a long wooden canoe, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. There are no compasses, no written maps, no instruments to chart the way. Yet the voyagers of the Pacific, the Polynesians, found paths across thousands of miles of open water by watching the stars. Each star's rising and setting marked a direction, and the sky became a living compass. Beneath them, the swell of the sea told its own story, with currents and wave patterns hinting at distant islands hidden beyond the horizon. Daily life on such journeys was both ordinary and extraordinary. Canoes carried families, food, and tools, and nights passed beneath the canopy of constellations. Imagine the rhythm of paddles in the water, the salty air thick with the scent of seaweed, and the steady murmur of sailors recalling chants that encoded star paths. Navigation was not only practical but also deeply cultural, passed from master navigator to apprentice through memory, story, and ritual. These voyagers did not see themselves as crossing an empty ocean. To them, the sea was mapped with wayfinding cues: the color of clouds that reflected lagoons, the flight patterns of birds, the faint scent of land carried on the wind. The world itself seemed to speak to them, if only one listened carefully enough. Over centuries, these techniques connected islands scattered like stepping stones across the Pacific, knitting communities together through exchange, migration, and shared knowledge. Today, scientists and explorers look back at this tradition with wonder. Modern navigation owes much to these early systems of orientation, and even space exploration finds echoes of Polynesian voyaging. Just as the stars once guided canoes across the Pacific, so too are stars and cosmic landmarks envisioned as guides for ships that will someday cross the vast oceans of space. Imagine the continuity: ancient sailors leaning into the wind, astronauts gazing from orbit, both trusting the patterns of the cosmos to find their way forward. Imagine yourself in the 6th century, standing at the crossroads of empires where trade routes carried spices, gems, and whispers of secrets. Among the most closely guarded treasures of the East was silk, shimmering fabric woven from threads so fine they seemed almost alive. In China, silkworms and their methods of cultivation were protected with the severity of state law. To reveal them was treason, to steal them, unthinkable. Yet the hunger for silk in distant lands was insatiable. Draped across emperors and merchants alike, it became a symbol of wealth and power, a fabric that seemed to carry the glow of the sun itself. Now, imagine 2 monks, journeying quietly under the cover of religious duty. They moved along dusty roads and through mountain passes, their mission cloaked in secrecy. According to legend, they concealed silkworm eggs inside hollowed-out bamboo canes, disguised as simple walking staffs. Within those canes, they carried not only fragile life but the seeds of transformation. When the monks finally reached Byzantium, they delivered their secret to Emperor Justinian, who envisioned an empire no longer dependent on costly imports. From that moment, the balance of global trade began to shift. Europe's first silk workshops emerged, guarded by walls just as tightly as China's had been. The flow of wealth redirected, and the empire gained both prestige and power. Imagine the slow unraveling of this hidden story, threads stretching across continents, spun in secrecy, woven into the fabric of history. What began as a quiet act of smuggling would ripple through centuries, shaping the very garments worn in courts, cathedrals, and palaces. A simple cocoon, carried in silence, altering economies and weaving new destinies. Imagine yourself standing in the hall of a German city in the mid-16th century. The air carries the faint aroma of wax candles and damp stone, mingled with the murmur of voices in Latin and German. Across a long table, princes, bishops, and envoys gather in heavy robes, each representing a fragment of the fractured Holy Roman Empire. For decades, religious divisions had spilled into conflict, with towns and territories torn between the old faith of Catholicism and the new convictions of Lutheran reform. By 1555, the exhaustion of endless quarrels pressed these rulers toward an uneasy compromise, later called the Peace of Augsburg. Daily life under this settlement shifted in subtle but lasting ways. The treaty established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, meaning the faith of the ruler would determine the faith of the land. In a small village, this might mean the church bells ringing for a Catholic Mass one year, only to call worshippers to a Lutheran sermon the next, depending on who governed. Ordinary people adjusted quietly, their rhythms of devotion bending to political tides. Yet for all its limitations, this arrangement brought a reprieve from war. Farmers could return to fields, markets could reopen, and families could plan futures without the constant fear of armies marching through their doorsteps. The Peace of Augsburg did not resolve the deeper tensions of belief, it merely managed them. Minorities often remained vulnerable, and other reform movements, like Calvinism, were excluded. Still, the treaty introduced a fragile recognition that differing convictions could coexist within a single empire, if only by agreement to disagree. This seed of tolerance, though partial, foreshadowed later ideas of pluralism and religious freedom. Today, when you encounter diverse communities sharing the same civic space, the quiet echo of Augsburg lingers. Its legacy lies not in triumph but in compromise, in the recognition that peace sometimes depends less on unity than on the willingness to let difference endure. Imagine yourself along the marshy canals of southern Iraq in the 9th century, where the air is thick with heat and salt from the land's overworked soil. Here, tens of thousands of East African slaves, called the Zanj, were forced into back-breaking labor, draining swamps and cultivating fields that enriched the Abbasid Empire. For most, life was an endless cycle of exhaustion and silence. But out of this silence rose one of history's most overlooked uprisings, the Zanj Rebellion. Beginning in 869 CE, the revolt stretched on for nearly 15 years, led by Ali ibn Muhammad, who promised freedom, dignity, and new order. The rebels carved out strongholds in the wetlands, using their knowledge of the terrain as a shield against imperial armies. Imagine the rhythm of their lives shifting, from the relentless scrape of toil under the sun to the tense quiet of night watches, listening for distant hoofbeats. For decades, they resisted one of the strongest empires of their age, building fortified camps and even governing captured territories as if they were an independent state. Though eventually crushed by Abbasid forces, the rebellion left deep marks. It revealed the fragility of empires that relied on human bondage, and it offered a glimpse of how oppressed people could organize across vast differences in language and origin. Today, the echoes of the Zanj Rebellion resurface whenever struggles for freedom, dignity, and recognition arise. You can sense in their story a quiet but enduring reminder that even in the harshest conditions, voices long suppressed will find ways to rise, carrying with them the timeless demand for justice. Imagine the savannas of 17th-century Angola, dotted with villages built of clay and reed, smoke rising slowly from hearths where families gathered after long days of tending crops. Into this world of shifting alliances and constant threats was born Queen Nzinga, a leader whose name would echo far beyond her lifetime. She ruled at a time when Portuguese settlers pressed inland, seeking slaves and dominion, reshaping the land's rhythms with violence and trade. Nzinga did not meet this advance with silence. In one of her most remembered encounters, she faced Portuguese officials who offered no chair for her at negotiations, intending to humiliate her. Calmly, she instructed an attendant to kneel, creating a human seat on which she sat, looking her counterparts in the eye. It was not merely defiance, It was a declaration that dignity could not be stripped away by foreign ritual. Her strategies blended diplomacy and battle. She negotiated treaties when they served her people, then broke them when betrayal made resistance the only path. She commanded armies drawn from diverse communities, men and women alike, skilled in ambushes and in the use of terrain to offset European weaponry. Forest paths, rivers, and mountains became allies, concealing movement and fracturing the power of musket and horse. For decades she held her ground, even as kingdoms rose and fell around her. When Portuguese forces tightened their grip, she shifted alliances, sometimes siding with former enemies if survival demanded it. Through this fluid strategy, Nzinga showed that resistance was not only about the battlefield, but about memory, symbolism, and the ability to preserve autonomy in the face of overwhelming force. Today, her story lingers not as a tale of conquest, but as a reminder of endurance. Imagine her court at twilight, the air heavy with wood smoke and the murmur of counsel. Each choice she made carried the weight of survival, each act of defiance laying foundations for future struggles against domination. Imagine yourself walking through the heart of 9th-century Baghdad, where the air is warm and filled with the quiet rustle of parchment. You enter a vast hall known as the House of Wisdom. Shelves stretch upward, crowded with manuscripts carried from Greece, India, and Persia. Scribes bend over their desks, carefully translating works of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics into Arabic. The rhythm of their pens is steady, as though they are preserving not just words, but entire civilizations of knowledge. Daily life in this center of scholarship was a blend of the ordinary and the profound. Scholars debated over tea, merchants brought ink and parchment from distant markets, and apprentices learned to copy texts by lamplight. Imagine yourself seated beside them, the room thick with the scent of oils and candles, the quiet hum of voices weaving ideas together. Here, Euclid's geometry mingled with Indian numerals, and Galen's medicine sat alongside Persian astronomy. Knowledge that might have vanished forever found refuge in these walls. The House of Wisdom was more than a library. It was a meeting ground of cultures and a workshop for discovery. Scholars refined algebra, mapped the stars, and questioned the movements of planets with instruments carefully crafted by artisans. Their studies carried a sense of patience. No rush, no urgency, only the slow layering of thought upon thought. Over time, the works preserved and expanded here would travel westward, translated again into Latin, and quietly seed the intellectual soil of Europe's Renaissance. Even today, when we speak of science, philosophy, or the sharing of ideas across borders, we echo that spirit. The House of Wisdom reminds us that progress is rarely born in isolation. It is built by hands that copy, voices that translate, and minds willing to listen to one another across languages and centuries. Imagine standing in that hall, hearing the soft turn of a page, and knowing those sounds carried forward into the very foundations of modern thought. Imagine yourself in the rugged lands of ancient Sparta, where the mountains closed in and the air was thick with the scent of olive groves and dust. Life here was ordered, rigid, and sharpened by discipline. At the heart of Spartan power lay not only its warriors but also the Helots, an enslaved people bound to the soil. They tilled the fields, harvested the grain, and supported the city's austere system, so that the elite might devote themselves entirely to war. Yet beneath the rhythm of farming seasons ran a constant undercurrent of unrest. The Helots were many, far outnumbering their masters, and their labor was both indispensable and resented. From time to time, this hidden tension broke into revolt. Imagine a quiet night, broken by whispers in the fields, or the sudden strike of coordinated resistance. The Helot uprisings were not singular events but recurring struggles, sparked by desperation and the relentless weight of oppression. Some revolts lasted years, threatening the very stability of Sparta. The Spartans responded with ruthless control, rituals of intimidation, secret police, and calculated violence designed to keep rebellion always just at bay. Still, the Helots endured, resisting not only with open defiance but through small acts of survival, slowing their work, shaping songs of grief, clinging to their communities. Their story is not only one of subjugation but of persistence. Imagine the paradox of a society that celebrated freedom for its citizens while sustaining itself through bondage. The Helot revolts remind us that beneath every polished history of glory lies another layer, quieter but equally real, a rhythm of resistance echoing across centuries. The tension between those who hold power and those who labor under it is as old as civilization, and the Helots of Sparta stand as a stark reminder of that enduring struggle. Imagine yourself walking through a dense woodland where the light filters gently through a canopy of ancient trees. The air is cool, carrying the scent of moss, pine resin, and damp earth. In many early cultures, places like this were not simply forests but sacred groves, spaces set apart from ordinary life, believed to be inhabited by gods, spirits, or ancestral presences. Boundaries were often marked with stones or wooden posts, signaling that within lay a realm where silence and reverence were required. To enter was to step into a different rhythm of existence, where every rustle of leaves might be a whisper from the unseen. Daily life around these groves reflected a mixture of fear and respect. Farmers might pause before cutting too close, hunters would avoid taking game inside, and travelers left small offerings of grain, flowers, or poured wine at the roots of venerable trees. The preservation of these spaces was not managed through written law but through shared belief, carried forward by ritual and story. Violating the grove was thought to risk illness, misfortune, or divine punishment, a system of protection grounded in reverence rather than regulation. Across cultures, from the oak sanctuaries of the Celts to the sacred fig trees of India, these preserved places created early models of conservation. By safeguarding the land for spiritual reasons, communities inadvertently protected entire ecosystems, ensuring that groves became havens for plants, animals, and water sources. What began as devotion to unseen forces carried lasting practical effects, sustaining balance in landscapes that might otherwise have been stripped bare. Today, echoes of those traditions survive in conservation ethics. Modern national parks, nature reserves, and heritage forests embody the same principle: that certain spaces should be set apart, shielded from exploitation, and valued not merely for utility but for the deeper meaning they hold. The sacred groves of the past remind us that protection of the natural world often begins with reverence, with a recognition that some places are best left untouched. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a vast wooden vessel in the early 15th century. The sea stretches endlessly, but the ship beneath your feet feels more like a floating city. This is one of Zhang He's treasure ships, part of the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen. Commissioned by the Ming dynasty, the fleet set sail between 1405 and 1433, carrying not only silks and porcelain but also envoys, interpreters, and gifts meant to weave distant lands into a shared network of trade and diplomacy. Zhang He himself was an admiral of remarkable presence. Born into a Muslim family in Yunnan, captured as a boy, and eventually rising through the ranks of the imperial court, he became the trusted commander of voyages that spanned the Indian Ocean. Imagine the rhythm of life aboard his fleet: sailors repairing ropes thick with salt, cooks preparing rice over small stoves, scholars recording details of foreign customs. The air was heavy with the scent of spice cargoes, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, that would soon transform kitchens across China. The fleet reached as far as East Africa, visiting ports in today's Kenya and Somalia, exchanging gifts of porcelain for ivory, giraffes, and incense. These encounters were not merely commercial. They were ceremonial, designed to affirm the Ming Emperor's prestige. Local rulers, in turn, found their names inscribed in Chinese records, binding them into a web of acknowledgement. For nearly 3 decades, this naval project revealed a vision of globalization long before Columbus or da Gama altered European maps. And yet, the voyages eventually ceased. Court factions argued that such costly expeditions distracted from defending China's borders. The massive ships were left to rot, and records faded. Still, when you trace modern trade routes across the Indian Ocean, you can sense the ghostly wake of Zhang He's fleet, a reminder that the ocean's highways were charted not once, but many times, by civilizations seeking connection. Picture the year 1215 along the banks of the River Thames, where the meadows of Runnymede stretched wide and damp beneath an English sky heavy with summer rain. Here, King John of England faced a gathering of barons, their armor dulled from travel, their banners limp in the wet air. These men had grown weary of arbitrary taxes, failed wars, and the king's unchecked power. What unfolded was less a moment of triumph than of reluctant compromise, sealed in the ink and wax of a document later called the Magna Carta. The charter itself was practical and immediate. It demanded limits on royal taxation, guaranteed certain rights for landholders, and established that even the king was bound by law. At first, its scope was narrow, tied to feudal grievances and the interests of the elite. Yet within its clauses lay a seed of something larger, an idea that authority could be restrained not by violence alone, but by written agreement and shared principle. Imagine the parchment itself, its Latin words densely packed, more concerned with tolls, debts, and inheritances than with lofty ideals. Few in that meadow could have foreseen that centuries later, fragments of its language would be echoed in the frameworks of constitutions across the world. "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by lawful judgment," became a whisper that traveled through time, shaping ideas of due process, trial by jury, and the balance between ruler and ruled. The shadows of Magna Carta stretch long. Though King John soon sought to annul it, and conflict continued, the precedent lingered, like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples widening across generations. Even today, when people speak of rights and freedoms, they unknowingly stand within its echoes, bound to that meadow where damp earth and ink first joined to restrain a monarch. Imagine yourself seated in the shaded tiers of an ancient Greek theater. The marble is cool beneath you, the air alive with murmurs as the play begins. We remember the names of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, yet hidden in the shadows are women whose voices also shaped the stage. Their works are almost lost to us, but fragments and records whisper of playwrights who dared to write in a world where the theater was dominated by men. In daily life, Greek women often lived within the boundaries of home, managing households, weaving, and raising children. Yet some found ways to step beyond these walls through poetry and drama. Imagine one such woman composing lines by lamplight, the wax faintly perfumed with honey, her words carrying themes of longing, injustice, or quiet defiance. Though many of their plays did not survive, references to female authors suggest that they wrote with boldness, questioning social order and exploring the inner lives of women rarely given space in public discourse. These dramatists challenged the assumption that only men could capture the human condition. Through allegory and myth, they placed female characters at the center of conflict and resolution. A heroine might argue against her confinement, or a chorus might echo the grief of women silenced by war. Their plays offered not just entertainment, but subtle critiques of inequality, wrapped within familiar forms. Imagine the audience, perhaps unsettled yet intrigued, listening to words that quietly unraveled expectations. Although time eroded most of their creations, the legacy of these women endures in the way theater evolved. Their courage carved faint but enduring lines into the history of performance, lines later echoed in the voices of modern dramatists and in movements for gender rights. The stage, once closed to them, became a platform where their spirit persists, reminding us that even when nearly erased, the quiet rebellion of art can ripple across centuries. Imagine yourself in Spain at the close of the 15th century. The streets of Granada are alive with merchants and scholars, yet beneath the surface of celebration at the Reconquista's end lies an air of uncertainty. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, demanding that Jews either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. For families whose roots stretched back centuries, this meant abandoning homes, businesses, and the very soil where ancestors rested. The decree was not simply a religious act but an upheaval of daily life, scattering entire communities overnight. Picture the hurried departure. Households selling possessions for far less than their worth, carts heavy with books, instruments, and tools. Many left carrying more knowledge than material wealth. Doctors, translators, merchants, and financiers traveled east toward the Ottoman Empire, north into Europe, or across the Mediterranean. In their exile, they carried networks of skills and traditions that would reshape the places they settled. The Ottoman sultans welcomed their expertise, weaving them into court life and commerce. Italian ports absorbed their trade links, while financial innovations once rooted in Iberia began to spread more widely. The loss was twofold. Spain's cultural and intellectual fabric thinned, even as other regions prospered from this influx of knowledge. Imagine libraries where familiar texts no longer rested, classrooms where voices fell silent, marketplaces where trusted merchants vanished. Yet in exile, the community's resilience turned displacement into influence. The Alhambra Decree reminds us that forced migration has always reshaped history, not only through suffering but through the redirection of talent and memory. The movement of people, though born of injustice, often carried ideas farther than walls or borders could contain. Imagine yourself standing on the rocky coast of the Mediterranean, where the horizon is dotted with sails of slender ships. The air carries the salt of the sea, mingled with the fragrance of cedar planks freshly hewn for shipbuilding. These were the vessels of the Phoenicians, a people whose lives were bound to water, whose homes in cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos looked outward toward the sea rather than inland. Their days were filled with the rhythm of tides, the loading of amphorae filled with wine and olive oil, the careful packing of purple-dyed cloth, and the sound of ropes creaking against wooden masts. Daily life for a Phoenician merchant meant journeys that stretched far beyond familiar shores. They charted courses through the Aegean, across the North African coast, even as far as the misty isles of Britain where tin was mined. In every port, they carried not only goods but also knowledge. From them, the alphabet spread, a practical tool for keeping records, simplified from older scripts into a form that would become the ancestor of many modern languages. Imagine the careful scratch of a reed pen on papyrus, the letters forming contracts, inventories, and messages that tied distant communities together. Their influence was not proclaimed with empires or monuments but carried quietly on the sea lanes. Ports flourished because of their networks, and ideas traveled alongside cargo. Even today, the patterns of global shipping echo the routes they pioneered, while the written letters we use trace back to their innovations. Though their cities have largely faded and their names often lie buried in history books, the legacy of the Phoenicians persists in every vessel that crosses an ocean and every word written in alphabetic script. Their story is a reminder that influence can be lasting without being loud, carried not by armies, but by trade, by navigation, and by the simple act of writing. Imagine yourself in the highlands of Ethiopia, where stone churches cling to cliffs and the air is thin with altitude. Here, for more than 7 centuries, rulers claimed their right to power not simply through conquest, but through ancestry. This was the Solomonic dynasty, established in 1270, when Yakuno Amlak rose to the throne declaring himself a direct descendant of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. The claim was more than genealogy. It was a fusion of myth and politics that bound Ethiopia's identity to sacred history. Daily life under this dynasty was a blend of Christian ritual, agricultural rhythms, and the enduring presence of legend. Imagine farmers tending terraced fields while priests recited scripture in Gu-Ez, the ancient liturgical language. The dynasty's chronicles described the Ark of the Covenant as resting in Ethiopia, giving both ruler and people a sense of divine guardianship. Each coronation, each decree, carried the weight of being part of an unbroken line stretching back to Jerusalem itself. The Solomonic rulers were not always secure. They faced shifting alliances with Muslim sultanates, Portuguese missionaries, and later European colonizers. Yet their claim of Solomonic descent provided a powerful shield, a story that placed Ethiopia apart from other kingdoms, older than the new empires rising around it. Even in times of weakness, the legend offered continuity, a reassurance that the dynasty was more than a sequence of kings, it was a covenant. When Haile Selassie, the last emperor, was deposed in 1974, the dynasty's reign formally ended. And yet, its echoes remain. In Ethiopian identity, in Rastafarian faith that reveres Selassie as messianic, and in the idea that myths can shape nations as surely as armies or treaties. If you listen closely, you can still hear the quiet whisper of a story that bridged Africa and the ancient world, binding politics to prophecy for over 700 years. Imagine the rugged hills of southern France in the 12th century, dotted with stone villages and winding paths where shepherds led their flocks. Life here was quiet but uneasy, shaped by the tensions between ordinary faith and a rising movement that challenged the church itself. This movement was the Cathar faith, a Christian sect that saw the world as divided between spiritual light and material corruption. To them, the body was a prison for the soul, and true purity came through simplicity, equality, and the rejection of earthly power. Cathar communities were known for their austerity. Their spiritual leaders, called the perfect, lived without wealth or possessions, eating simple meals, traveling on foot, and guiding others with quiet counsel. Unlike much of medieval Europe, women could become leaders within their ranks, holding authority equal to men. Imagine gatherings in candlelit rooms, where words of Scripture were shared not as commands but as gentle reminders of another way of living. Yet their refusal to accept the authority of Rome made them dangerous in the eyes of the Catholic Church. By the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against them. Armies descended on towns such as Béziers and Carcassonne, their banners bright against smoke-darkened skies. Entire communities were wiped out, their beliefs declared heresy, their voices silenced by sword and flame. Still, ideas rarely vanish completely. Whispers of Cathar teaching lingered, carried in fragments of song, in tales told quietly, in hidden sympathy for those who had once sought a purer faith. Centuries later, echoes of their vision, of equality, simplicity, and spiritual resistance, would resurface in other movements, reminding us that even in suppression, some sparks endure. Imagine yourself riding across the vast steppe, the horizon stretching unbroken in every direction. A lone rider approaches, his horse breathing hard but steady, carrying a message bound for a distant city. He does not stop for long. At a small wooden outpost, another horse stands ready, fresh and strong. The rider hands over his message, mounts the new animal, and races on. This was the Mongol postal system, called the Yam, a network of relay stations that allowed messages, supplies, and even intelligence to move across the largest land empire the world had ever known. Daily life along these routes was practical and disciplined. At each station, families tended horses, maintained provisions, and welcomed weary couriers. Imagine the smell of hay stacked high in wooden barns, the warmth of a cooking fire, and the constant readiness of animals tethered for duty. The rhythm of the system was unbroken, day and night, as riders arrived and departed with the efficiency of flowing water. For merchants, generals, and rulers, this meant a message could travel hundreds of miles in just a few days, an achievement that astonished neighboring civilizations. The Yam was more than transport. It was an early form of connectivity, binding the far corners of the empire together. Orders from the Great Khan could reach remote outposts with remarkable speed, while intelligence reports, maps, and even luxury goods moved along the same routes. Imagine it as a living web stretched across Asia, where each station was a node, and the couriers were the signals passing between them. In its way, the system foreshadowed not only modern postal logistics but also the invisible flow of information we now know through the Internet. Though centuries have passed, the vision behind the Yam remains familiar. Rapid communication, coordinated networks, and the trust in a system larger than any individual. All these ideas echo into the structures of our modern world. Standing in the silence of the steppe, you can almost hear the pounding of hooves fading into the distance, carrying not just messages but the pulse of an empire held together by speed and connection. Imagine yourself beneath the vast skies of the Yucatan, where the stars stretch endlessly across warm, humid nights. For the Maya, these skies were not only a backdrop but a living text, carefully read and recorded. They traced the slow movement of Venus, the rhythm of the moon, and the cycles of the sun with astonishing precision. Their calendars, carved in stone and painted in codices, were more than tools of measurement. They were instruments of alignment, linking human life with the pulse of the cosmos. Each day carried meaning, each cycle a pattern that guided both sacred ritual and daily survival. Picture a farmer waiting for the right season to plant maize, his decision shaped not by chance but by the careful calculations of priests who studied celestial patterns. Imagine ceremonies timed to the equinox, when sunlight pierced the steps of temples, casting shadows that formed serpents slithering down carved stone. To live within the Maya calendar was to move with the universe itself, as if time and space folded into an unbroken dance between earth and sky. Centuries later, fragments of this knowledge still echo. Modern astronomy recognizes the accuracy of Maya calculations, their ability to predict eclipses and trace planetary cycles. Though much of their written heritage was lost, what remains reveals a civilization where science and spirituality were never separate, but seamlessly woven together. The Maya remind us that the act of watching the heavens is as old as humanity itself, a way of seeking order, connection, and meaning in the vastness above. Their calendars stand not only as relics of the past, but as quiet markers of how deeply human lives have always been guided by the turning of the stars. Imagine yourself beneath the wide skies of the American Southwest, where desert winds sweep across mesas and canyons. The land seems endless, yet stretching across it are faint traces of carefully laid stone roads, broad, straight, and purposeful. These were the roadways of the ancestral Pueblo peoples, often called the Shokoans, who built them nearly 1,000 years ago. The lines cut across desert sands and rocky plateaus with a precision that feels deliberate, as though guiding travelers not only across space but also toward a shared vision of order. Daily life for those who walked these paths might have been marked by routine journeys, carrying goods like turquoise, pottery, or food between great houses, or traveling to ceremonial centers. Imagine the sound of sandals on packed earth, the sight of distant walls of Chaco Canyon rising after days of walking under the sun. These roads, some as wide as modern highways, were more than practical passageways. They were expressions of planning, connecting communities scattered across difficult terrain into something resembling a networked society. The mystery of their full purpose remains. Archaeologists suggest they facilitated trade, pilgrimage, or political unity, but their straightness, sometimes cutting through cliffs and hills rather than bending around, suggests symbolic meaning as well. Walking them may have been as much a ritual act as a logistical one, binding people to landscapes regarded as sacred. In their quiet endurance, these roads foreshadow modern infrastructure. The concept that a community can be knit together by intentional pathways, linking distant lives into shared systems, is a principle that underlies today's highways and cities. Though many of the ancestral Pueblo roadways now lie half-buried by sand and time, they whisper of a sophisticated vision of connection, where movement across space was not random, but carefully guided by design. Imagine yourself in the late 18th century on the island of Saint-Domingue, where the air is thick with the scent of sugarcane and smoke from boiling houses. This colony, the wealthiest in the French Empire, was built on the relentless labor of enslaved Africans. Day after day, they worked under the sun, their lives reduced to the rhythm of harvest and punishment. Yet beneath this oppression, currents of resistance were gathering, soon to ignite the only successful slave uprising in history. In 1791, as revolutionary ideas from France reached across the Atlantic, enslaved people in the northern plains began to act. Imagine the hush of night broken by whispered plans, the steady gathering of men and women who carried with them not only anger, but a vision of freedom. What began as scattered revolts swelled into a coordinated insurrection, fields once filled with sugar now blazing with fire. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture emerged, skilled not only in battle but in diplomacy, guiding the movement beyond rebellion into the founding of a new state. For more than a decade, the struggle raged against French forces, foreign invasions, and the brutal attempt to restore slavery. Yet the revolutionaries endured, drawing strength from the shared memory of bondage and the determination to never return to it. In 1804, Haiti declared independence, becoming the first black republic and the first nation born from a slave revolt. The impact reached far beyond its shores. To enslaved communities across the Americas, Haiti became a symbol of possibility. To colonial powers, it was a warning that domination could not last forever. Even today, the Haitian Revolution whispers across history, reminding us that the quest for dignity and freedom can grow from the harshest soil, and that once sparked, it can burn bright enough to light the world. Picture the landscapes of medieval Japan, rice fields stretching in neat squares, the distant outline of mountains, and within fortified homes, the quiet discipline of a samurai household. Here, amid the rituals of sword practice and poetry, lived women who were not merely caretakers of estates, but trained defenders known as onabugeisha. Their lives balanced the duties of family with the readiness to fight, a dual existence often overlooked in the grand chronicles of war. From childhood, daughters of warrior families learned to handle the naginata, a polearm whose curved blade offered reach and balance. Imagine the sound of its arc cutting through air in practice yards, the steady rhythm of wooden sandals against packed earth. The weapon became both a symbol of feminine virtue and a practical tool of survival, suited to holding ground against armored foes. These women were not ceremonial figures. In times of invasion or siege, they stood on walls, rallied peasants, and at times led forces themselves. Stories survive of figures such as Tomo Guzan, remembered for her skill and presence on the battlefield during the Genpei War. Though surrounded by male commanders, she carved her own place in legend, her name carried in ballads and painted scrolls. Yet the image of the onabugeisha also lived in quieter roles, guardians of home and lineage, protectors when men were absent at distant wars. Over centuries, as samurai culture hardened into codes and ceremony, their presence was softened in memory, reduced to fragments of art and folklore. Still, their example lingers. When we reflect on the entanglement of gender and warfare, their shadows remind us that valor was never the province of men alone. Imagine yourself standing on a grassy plain in early medieval Scandinavia. Around you, free men of the community gather in a wide circle, their cloaks heavy with the chill of northern winds. This meeting is called the Thing, an assembly where disputes are settled, laws recited, and decisions made not by kings alone but by the voices of the people. There is no stone chamber, no gilded hall, only the open air and the rhythm of words passed from one speaker to another. Daily life flowed into these gatherings. Farmers left their fields, traders set aside their wares, and chieftains stepped down from their halls to stand as equals within the circle. Imagine the mingled sounds, the low murmur of conversation, the creak of wooden benches, the faint clinking of weapons carried more for identity than for battle. At the center, law speakers recited rules from memory, their voices steady, preserving tradition through repetition. Here, justice was spoken aloud, where all could hear. The Thing was more than a court, it was a place where collective authority emerged. Disputes over land, inheritance, or honor found resolution through agreement rather than endless feuds. Decisions carried legitimacy not because they were imposed, but because they were shared. In this way, the Thing balanced individual freedom with communal responsibility, a fragile but enduring rhythm that kept order in societies spread across harsh landscapes. Centuries later, echoes of these assemblies remain in the foundations of parliaments and democratic councils. The idea that governance could arise from gathering, listening, and deciding together traces a line back to those open fields. Imagine standing there, the wind tugging at your cloak, hearing voices rise and fall in measured tones, a reminder that even in rugged times, people sought order not just through power, but through participation. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling streets of 9th-century Baghdad, the air filled with the fragrance of spices, the call of merchants, and the rustle of parchment and papyrus. In this thriving capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a quiet transformation was underway. From China came the knowledge of papermaking, and soon Baghdad's workshops turned it into a revolution. Compared with parchment, paper was lighter, cheaper, and easier to produce in vast quantities. Suddenly, words could travel farther, ideas could be copied more quickly, and knowledge was no longer confined to the wealthy or the clergy. Picture the mills along the Tigris, where fibers were soaked, pulped, and pressed into sheets that dried beneath the desert sun. These sheets flowed into markets, schools, and libraries, feeding the great translation movement where Greek, Persian, and Indian works were rendered into Arabic. In the House of Wisdom, Scholars debated philosophy, charted stars, and calculated medicine, their manuscripts multiplying because paper made copying practical. Imagine scribes bent over low tables, the gentle scratch of their pens filling rooms where lamps burned late into the night. The spread of paper reshaped daily life. Bureaucrats kept clearer records, poets found wider audiences, and merchants carried contracts across trade routes. Literacy expanded beyond elites, and the rhythm of learning entered homes and mosques. Long before Europe's printing press, Baghdad's paper revolution democratized access to knowledge, weaving scholarship into the texture of society. Even centuries later, when paper spread into Europe, its roots traced back to these Abbasid mills, where the simple act of pressing fibers into sheets changed the fate of human thought. Imagine yourself walking through a quiet medieval village in the mid-14th century. The air feels unusually still, broken only by the distant toll of a church bell. Many homes stand empty, their thatched roofs sagging, fields left untilled. The Black Death had swept through Europe, leaving behind silence where once there had been the clamor of daily life. Whole families were gone, and with them, the labor that sustained the feudal order. Lords who once commanded crowded manors now faced a world in which half their workforce had vanished. Daily rhythms changed abruptly. Where once peasants had little choice but to serve, suddenly their hands were scarce and therefore valuable. Surviving laborers found themselves in a position to negotiate. Higher wages, shorter service, even the right to move to new villages offering better conditions. Imagine the shift. A plowman once bound to his lord's fields now walking toward a neighboring estate, confident he would be welcomed with better pay. For the first time, many felt leverage in a system that had long denied them freedom. The ruling elite tried to resist. In England, the Statute of Labourers attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, punishing workers who demanded more. But laws could not fully contain the new reality. The scarcity of people gave weight to those who remained, and over generations, the rigid ties of feudalism loosened. Towns swelled with migrants seeking opportunity, guilds gained strength, and markets began to function with a new sense of mobility. The echoes of this shift are still felt. Modern labor rights, ideas of fair pay, bargaining power, and the dignity of work can trace part of their lineage to this moment of crisis. Out of the devastation of plague emerged not only sorrow but also transformation, where the balance between those who owned land and those who worked it tilted toward a more negotiated, if still imperfect, relationship. Imagine yourself in ancient China more than 3,000 years ago, during the Shang dynasty. The royal court is hushed, the air carrying the faint scent of burning bones and resin. Before the king lies a polished fragment of ox scapula or turtle shell. Onto its smooth surface, scribes carve small, deliberate marks, questions about harvests, battles, weather, and the will of ancestors. Then heat is applied, and as the bone cracks, diviners read its patterns like a map of fate. These objects, called oracle bones, became the earliest known evidence of Chinese writing. The questions etched into them reveal a rhythm of life tied to ritual and uncertainty. Imagine the steady hand of the scribe, pressing symbols with a sharp tool, while others watch in silence for the first wisp of smoke. Kings sought reassurance that their rule aligned with the unseen forces of the universe. Was the crop destined to fail? Should an army march north? The answers were drawn not from logic but from the shifting lines of fire and fracture. Though born from ritual, these inscriptions carried something enduring. The characters carved into bone evolved into the written forms still recognizable in Chinese script today. A word for rain, a sign for harvest, the names of rulers, each is a thread binding the present to those early nights of divination. What was once a sacred act of seeking guidance slowly became a system of language, used for governance, poetry, and record-keeping. The oracle bones remind us that writing itself began not merely as communication, but as a bridge between the human and the divine. When you look at modern Chinese characters, you are glimpsing echoes of those first careful marks, carved in firelight, carrying questions into the silence of eternity. Imagine the dense forests and waterways of northeastern North America, where longhouses stretched beneath tall pines and smoke drifted from communal fires. Here, centuries before the birth of modern states, the nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, crafted a system of governance that bound diverse peoples into one union. Their great law of peace was not written on parchment but carried in memory, recited in councils, and symbolized in a wampum belt of white and purple shells. At its heart was the idea of unity through balance. The Confederacy joined the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, later joined by the Tuscarora, into a league where decisions required consensus. Chiefs, chosen by clan mothers, were expected to act not for personal power but for the welfare of all. Imagine councils gathered in the flickering light of fire, voices rising and falling until harmony was reached, for only when agreement was achieved could action follow. This structure emphasized both equality and responsibility. Women held vital authority, selecting leaders and shaping decisions, while the chiefs themselves were seen not as rulers but as caretakers of peace. The Great Law taught that choices must be weighed with consideration for future generations, a principle often summarized as thinking 7 generations ahead. When Europeans arrived, they observed this system with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Yet the echoes of the Iroquois Constitution found their way into the language of Enlightenment thinkers and, eventually, into the democratic frameworks of the United States. Though adapted and altered, the core ideas, representation, balance of power, accountability, carry the imprint of Haudenosaunee thought. Today, the Great Law of Peace remains more than history. It endures as a living reminder that democracy need not begin with kings and parliaments, but can rise from councils in forest clearings, where the voices of many joined to speak as one. Imagine yourself in the city of Würzburg in the early 17th century. The air is thick with unease, the church bells tolling not in celebration but in warning. Whispers curl through the narrow streets, carrying names of neighbors accused of witchcraft. In the crowded marketplace, people speak in lowered voices, afraid that suspicion might turn toward them. Fear seeped into daily life so deeply that even the innocent lived as if already condemned. Trials unfolded with grim repetition. Imagine dark wooden chambers where magistrates questioned the accused, the flicker of candlelight casting uneasy shadows. Children, widows, and even members of the city's elite found themselves entangled in accusations. Testimonies, often shaped by rumor or coercion, became evidence enough. The rhythm of life in Würzburg turned unsteady, each verdict reinforcing the belief that unseen forces were at work. The scale was staggering. Hundreds lost their lives, swept away in a tide of hysteria that blurred truth and fear. Imagine the silence left behind in homes emptied of parents or children, the echo of loss woven into the city's fabric. What began as an attempt to cleanse society only deepened its fractures. The trials became less about justice and more about the dangerous momentum of unchecked suspicion. Today, the memory of Würzburg's witch trials lingers as more than history. It stands as a quiet warning about what happens when fear overrides fairness, when rumor replaces evidence, and when justice bends beneath collective panic. Imagine yourself walking those same streets now, where centuries have softened the stones, yet the lesson endures. Safeguards in modern courts exist not by chance, but because of moments when justice once faltered. Imagine yourself on the wide steppe, where endless grass bends beneath the wind and the horizon stretches unbroken. Here, the Scythians lived, a nomadic people whose lives moved with their herds and their horses. To them, mobility was strength, and the horse was more than an animal. It was freedom, companion, and weapon. Their mastery of mounted archery reshaped warfare, allowing them to strike swiftly, vanish, and return again, a rhythm of battle that unsettled empires rooted in stone walls and cities. Daily life unfolded in tents of felt, the smoke of fires curling into the sky. Clothing was crafted not only for survival but with a style that spread across Eurasia. Trousers for riding, decorated belts, and patterned textiles that echoed in later cultures. Imagine artisans etching gold plaques with scenes of deer and eagles, symbols of a world deeply tied to both nature and the spirit realm. Their burial mounds, still rising from the plains, reveal treasures of art and armor, traces of lives spent in motion yet anchored by ritual. The Scythians' influence did not vanish with their fading power. Their methods of combat shaped how armies across Europe and Asia adapted to mounted warfare. Their styles of dress and ornament traveled with trade and migration, weaving into the identities of successor peoples. Even the stories written by Greeks and Persians carry echoes of admiration and fear for these horse lords of the steppe. Imagine the sound of hooves against the earth, a reminder that cultures built on movement can leave lasting marks, not through monuments of stone, but through the patterns they imprint across landscapes and centuries. Imagine yourself on a dusty road stretching across the Sahara in the 14th century. The air shimmers with heat, and in the distance you see a procession that seems endless, thousands of attendants, soldiers, and merchants moving in slow rhythm. At the center of this vast caravan is Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, journeying toward Mecca. Camels sway under the weight of gold dust and bars, their saddlebags glinting in the sun. The air carries the smell of leather, spices, and sweat, while voices chant prayers that echo across the dunes. This was not only a pilgrimage but a statement, one that would ripple far beyond its moment. Daily life along the route transformed as Musa passed through. In towns where the caravan stopped, markets were flooded with gold. Imagine a small shopkeeper in Cairo suddenly finding his coins doubled in value, only to discover that prices had risen just as quickly. Musa's generosity was legendary. He distributed wealth freely to the poor, to scholars, to merchants, but his gifts disrupted local economies, causing inflation that lingered long after he moved on. Yet his journey was not only about wealth. In Mecca, he reinforced Mali's ties to the wider Islamic world, commissioning mosques and inviting scholars back to Timbuktu. The libraries and universities that grew there turned the city into a beacon of knowledge, where parchment crackled with the words of law, astronomy, and theology. Imagine the soft murmur of students reading aloud in candlelit rooms, their voices part of a legacy that began with a single pilgrimage. The memory of Mansa Musa lives on less in monuments than in stories. He is still called the richest man in history, his name tied to both myth and reality. His pilgrimage reshaped how Africa was seen, placing Mali on medieval maps and in the imaginations of distant traders. What remains is a reminder that a single journey, grounded in faith, can alter economies, cultures, and the way a continent is remembered. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Palermo in the 12th century. The air is warm with the scent of citrus groves and sea salt drifting from the harbor. Around you, the sounds of many tongues mingle, Latin, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, woven together in the daily rhythm of a kingdom unlike most others in medieval Europe. This was Norman Sicily, a realm where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side, each leaving traces that still linger in its architecture, its scholarship, and its memory. The Normans, originally warriors from northern Europe, had conquered the island by 1091. Yet rather than erasing the cultures they found, they absorbed them. Imagine palaces decorated with Arabic calligraphy, churches glowing with Byzantine mosaics, and scholars translating texts from Arabic into Latin, carrying ancient knowledge into Western Europe. In the royal court, administrators and advisors came from different faiths, their roles chosen as much for ability as for creed. Daily life reflected this blending. Markets offered spices and fabrics from Islamic lands, while processions honored Christian saints and synagogues stood within city walls. This coexistence was not free of hierarchy or tension, but it carried a rare sense of possibility. For nearly a century, Norman kings cultivated an atmosphere where diversity was not just tolerated but harnessed as strength. The island became a crossroads of ideas, linking North Africa, Byzantium, and Latin Christendom in a shared conversation. In time, shifting politics and outside pressures eroded this fragile balance. Yet the legacy of Norman Sicily endures in its stone cathedrals, Arabic-arched palaces, and manuscripts that bridged cultures. When we speak of multicultural societies today, echoes of this medieval experiment remind us that coexistence is neither new nor idealized. It has been lived, imperfectly but vividly, on a sunlit island in the Mediterranean. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace in 11th century China during the Song dynasty. Stalls overflow with silk, porcelain, and tea, merchants call out in steady rhythm, and the air is heavy with the scent of roasted chestnuts and ink. Traders from distant provinces and along the Silk Roads exchanged goods in quantities so vast that heavy strings of copper coins became burdensome. Out of this practical challenge emerged a quiet revolution, the world's first true paper money. At first, these notes were issued by private merchants as a kind of promissory slip, easier to carry than bags of coin. The government soon recognized their potential and began producing official paper currency known as jiaozi. Imagine holding one of these notes, thin yet sturdy, printed with careful calligraphy and official seals, its value guaranteed not by its weight in metal, but by trust in the authority behind it. This innovation required a shift in thinking. For centuries, wealth had been tied to tangible metal, gold, silver, copper, things that clinked and weighed heavily in the hand. Paper money was weightless, almost fragile, yet it represented vast sums. Confidence in these notes was as important as their design, for their power rested on collective belief rather than intrinsic worth. The system was not without difficulty. Inflation, counterfeiting, and overprinting sometimes weakened faith in the notes. Yet the principle endured, shaping not only China's economy but inspiring future financial systems across the world. When you hold a modern banknote today, its distant ancestor lies in those Song dynasty markets, where innovation turned paper and ink into the backbone of exchange. Imagine yourself standing in the heat of the Persian plateau, the air shimmering under the midday sun. Water seems scarce, the soil cracked and dry, yet beneath your feet runs a hidden network of life. The Persians, more than 2,000 years ago, carved underground canals called qanats. These tunnels gently sloped from mountain aquifers to distant fields, carrying cool, clean water across miles without pumps or modern machines. What seemed barren on the surface was sustained below by quiet streams of ingenuity. Daily life depended on these unseen rivers. Farmers guided channels into orchards heavy with pomegranates and dates, while villages gathered around the steady trickle that emerged from qanat outlets. Imagine the relief of cool water touching your hands after walking across the hot dust, the sound of clay jars filling in a shaded courtyard, the rhythm of survival shaped by hidden engineering. Entire cities, from Yaz to ancient Persepolis, thrived because of this patient, subterranean flow. The construction of qanats demanded precision. Teams of diggers worked in shafts sunk deep into the earth, the air thick with dust, the ground echoing with the tap of tools. Each tunnel had to maintain a delicate gradient. Too steep and water would rush away, too flat and it would stagnate. The work was dangerous, yet it created systems that endured for centuries, requiring little energy beyond human labor and the wisdom of careful design. Even today, qanats are studied as models of sustainable irrigation. Their quiet efficiency, harnessing gravity rather than force, speaks to principles modern engineers seek to revive in an age of climate stress and water scarcity. Imagine walking along one of these ancient shafts, hearing the faint murmur of water far below, and realizing it is the same stream that once nourished empires. The qanat is not only a relic of the past, but a reminder that true innovation often flows gently, unseen, and lasting. Imagine yourself in the bustling heart of Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, where clay brick streets carried the weight of trade, prayer, and power. At the center stood Hammurabi, the king who sought to bind his diverse empire with something stronger than armies alone: law. Inscribed onto towering stone stelae were hundreds of decrees, written in careful cuneiform, visible for all to read, or at least to hear read aloud. These rules covered the rhythm of life: wages for laborers, penalties for theft, contracts for trade, and the famous principle of balance, an eye for an eye. It was justice both rigid and exacting, designed not merely to punish but to set order in a society where farmers, merchants, priests, and nobles lived side by side. Picture a craftsman examining his work under the watchful thought of these laws, knowing a mistake could bring severe consequence. Imagine a farmer standing before a local judge, clay tablets recording debts, with Hammurabi's code hanging over the proceedings as both shield and threat. The laws were not equal in their application. status mattered, and penalties weighed differently depending on one's rank, but the very act of setting them in stone gave the impression of permanence and authority. Centuries later, echoes of this legal structure can still be felt. The idea that written codes define justice, that laws must be recorded and applied systematically, traces back to these Babylonian stones. While the severity of eye for an eye has softened across time, the shadow of Hammurabi's effort remains, a reminder that civilizations have always sought stability through rules that bind individuals to the collective. Imagine standing before that ancient black steel, the carved words still clear, as if waiting to remind us that justice, however imperfect, has always been humanity's attempt to bring order to the chaos of life. Imagine yourself in the vast Sahel, where golden dunes meet stretches of savanna and the horizon seems to have no end. Along narrow, worn paths, caravans of camels move steadily, their padded feet pressing into the sand. The air is dry, heavy with dust, and faintly tinged with the smell of leather sacks carrying salt from the Sahara's mines. From the south, traders bring gold, glinting in small nuggets or dust carefully weighed on bronze scales. This exchange, salt for gold, was the lifeblood of Mali's trade routes, binding together distant worlds through steady movement across harsh landscapes. Daily life along these routes was shaped by rhythm and endurance. Merchants rose with the cool of dawn, wrapped in layers of cloth to shield against sun and wind. They traveled from oasis to oasis, where wells offered brief relief and markets sprang up with the chatter of many tongues. Imagine sitting at such a stop, hearing Berber, Arabic, and Mande spoken side by side, while spices, cloth, and copper mixed with the hum of barter. These were not fleeting encounters, but the threads that tied together villages, towns, and empires across Africa and beyond. At its height, Mali's wealth reached far beyond its borders. Gold from West Africa circulated through North Africa into Mediterranean economies, shaping the currency of kingdoms and fueling trade with Europe and the Middle East. Salt, essential for preserving food, gave balance to the exchange, a reminder that what is ordinary in one place can be priceless in another. The echoes of these trade routes remain. The principle of linking distant regions through complementary resources foreshadowed global markets. What began as caravans crossing deserts helped seed systems of economic interdependence that continue today. Though many of the paths have faded back into sand, the idea that wealth flows along routes carved by both necessity and vision is a legacy still shaping the world's economies. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of ancient Rome. The air is filled with the smell of freshly baked loaves, mingling with the dust and clamor of the forum. For the ordinary Roman citizen, bread was not just nourishment, it was a symbol of belonging, a daily reminder that the empire itself provided for its people. Beginning in the late Republic and continuing into the Empire, free distributions of grain, called the annona, became a cornerstone of Roman politics. Picture the rhythm of daily life. Long lines forming at public granaries, citizens carrying sacks of wheat through narrow streets, ovens glowing in crowded bakeries. These rations ensured survival for the urban poor, but they also bound people to the state. Politicians understood this well. Promises of free grain won loyalty, and emperors who kept supplies flowing were remembered as generous. Those who failed risked unrest, for hunger could spark anger more quickly than decrees or taxes ever could. The system went beyond mere survival. It reflected an early vision of welfare, the idea that a government bore responsibility for meeting basic needs. Yet it also revealed politics at its most pragmatic. Bread alone could not inspire devotion, so spectacles, chariot races, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, were paired with grain to secure favor. Bread and circuses became shorthand for a society where sustenance and entertainment tempered discontent. Though the empire eventually fell, the echoes of Rome's grain dole remain. Modern social safety nets, food assistance, and welfare programs trace faint lines back to those ancient distributions. Imagine standing in a Roman crowd, a loaf of bread in your hand, unaware that this simple act of receiving grain was part of a larger story, one that still whispers in today's debates about what societies owe their citizens. Imagine the English countryside before the Norman conquest, where small villages clustered around wooden halls, fields edged with hedgerows, and roads no more than dirt paths cut through meadow and forest. In this world, disputes did not always fall to kings or lords alone. Instead, free men gathered in what were called moot courts, local assemblies where questions of land, trade, and wrongdoing were debated and judged. These gatherings were often held in open air, sometimes beneath a sacred tree or beside a prominent mound. Picture farmers setting aside their tools, arriving with cloaks pulled close against the wind, voices low as they prepared to hear the matters of neighbors. At the center stood community leaders, but the authority of judgment rested not with one ruler but with the collective presence of the assembled. Each free man had the right to speak, to weigh evidence, and to shape the outcome. The proceedings were as much ritual as law. Oaths were sworn, witnesses gave their word, and fines were assigned in livestock or coin. The goal was not always punishment, but balance, restoring harmony to the village, ensuring that disputes did not fester into cycles of vengeance. Justice, here, was a shared responsibility, an act of community memory as much as legal code. Centuries later, echoes of these moot courts would reappear in the jury systems of common law. The idea that ordinary people, gathered together, could deliberate over truth and fairness has roots in those Anglo-Saxon assemblies, held under gray skies and in the hum of daily life. Even now, when jurors file into modern courtrooms, they unknowingly walk in the footsteps of villagers who once judged beneath ancient oaks. Imagine yourself in medieval Europe, when long roads stretched between bustling cities and holy sites. Traveling merchants and pilgrims faced dangers of theft and loss, yet the Knights Templar offered a solution both practical and mysterious. Within their fortified commanderies, a system of credit quietly emerged. Pilgrims could deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, carrying only a coded letter as proof. It was safer than gold, lighter than coin, and protected by the reputation of an order both feared and revered. Daily life around these financial networks was filled with the hum of both commerce and devotion. Monks in white mantles inscribed records, their quills scratching steadily against parchment, while traders and nobles arrived seeking the security of Templar services. Imagine the cool stillness of a stone chamber, the faint smell of wax and ink, and the guarded exchange of tokens that represented wealth stored far away. For many, it felt like touching a secret current of power that flowed invisibly across Christendom. This system was more than convenience. It was a precursor to the banking practices that would later dominate Europe: checks, promissory notes, and the idea of money detached from physical gold. The Templars' credit network allowed vast sums to move safely, financing crusades, trade, and even kingdoms. Yet it was also shrouded in suspicion, for secrecy and wealth made them targets. In time, their order fell, accused of heresy and dissolved under pressure, but their methods lingered long after their towers crumbled. Today, when you use a banknote, a check, or even a digital transfer, you glimpse echoes of this medieval invention. Imagine standing in one of those quiet halls, hearing the scratch of pen on parchment, and realizing you are witnessing the earliest outlines of a system that still governs the flow of money in the modern world. The Templars may be gone, but their shadow remains in every institution where trust is traded for credit. Imagine yourself standing at a bustling Lisbon harbor in the early 16th century. The air is thick with salt, tar, and the pungent scent of pepper, cloves, and cinnamon carried from the distant east. Portuguese ships, their sails patched from months at sea, returned heavy with cargo that was worth its weight in silver. For Europe, spices were more than flavor. They were medicine, preservative, and symbol of wealth. To control their flow was to control power itself. The Portuguese, by seizing key routes around Africa to India, created a monopoly that reshaped both European kitchens and global economies. Picture the fortresses rising along coasts from Goa to Malacca, where cannon fire and contracts ensured Portuguese dominance. Merchants and monarchs watched in envy as Lisbon became the hub of a new world order, its markets overflowing with exotic goods. Yet this monopoly also sparked conflict, trade wars on the seas, rivalries with the Ottomans and Venetians, and eventually the entry of Dutch and English fleets eager to break the hold. For the people in Asia, this shift meant local markets bent toward foreign demands, harvests redirected, and ports transformed into battlegrounds of empire. The taste of nutmeg or pepper on a European table carried within it the weight of conquest and global change. Imagine families savoring meals that connected them to unseen sailors, distant plantations, and wars fought far away. The Portuguese spice monopoly stands as one of the earliest examples of globalization, where everyday life, what one ate, traded, or valued, was bound to the currents of distant seas. Even today, in the simple act of seasoning food, faint echoes of those first voyages remain, reminders of how power once traveled hidden in sacks of spice. Imagine yourself in a dim desert cave in Egypt, where the air is cool and still, thick with the scent of dust and old papyrus. In 1945, jars buried for centuries were broken open near Nag Hammadi, revealing hidden Gnostic scriptures, texts once suppressed in the early centuries of Christianity. These writings, fragile and worn, carried alternate visions of faith, portraying a world where salvation came not through obedience alone but through secret knowledge, an awakening of the divine spark within each person. Daily life for early Gnostic communities may have been quiet and precarious. They gathered in small groups, perhaps in simple homes by lamplight, reading aloud words that challenged official doctrine. Imagine the hushed voices as they recited stories of Jesus not as a distant figure of authority, but as a revealer of inner wisdom. For them, the cosmos was layered with mysteries, the material world a shadow of higher realities. Such ideas offered comfort to those who felt estranged from rigid structures, emphasizing a personal, intimate path to the divine. For centuries, these texts were silenced. Declared heretical, they were hidden away, their pages sealed under sand. Yet their rediscovery in the 20th century reshaped the study of religion, allowing scholars and seekers alike to glimpse alternative threads of early Christian thought. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and others revealed a spiritual landscape where questioning and inner reflection mattered as much as ritual and law. Today, their influence echoes in modern mysticism, in movements that seek spirituality beyond formal institutions, in the idea that faith can be found within as much as without. The hidden Gnostic scriptures remind us that history is not only the story of what survived in plain sight, but also of what was buried, waiting patiently to be read again. Imagine yourself in the misty hills of Iron Age Europe, where oak groves shelter quiet gatherings and the air is heavy with the smell of damp earth and smoke from distant hearths. Here, justice was not written on tablets or carved in stone, but carried in memory. The Celts entrusted their laws to druids, guardians of oral tradition who preserved rules of honor, responsibility, and restitution through recitation. In a world without written codes, the spoken word was the law, binding communities together in a rhythm of shared memory. Daily life moved in cycles of farming, feasting, and seasonal rituals. When disputes arose, over land, cattle, or injury, the Druids were called to settle them. Imagine the scene, elders listening in silence as a Druid recited precedents, his words carrying the weight of centuries. Punishments often took the form of fines or restitution rather than harsh physical penalties. To damage another's herd meant repayment, to injure another's kin meant compensation. The goal was less about vengeance than restoring balance, ensuring the community could endure together. This oral system demanded long training. A Druid might study for 20 years, memorizing vast bodies of law, myth, and ritual. Their knowledge connected the people not only to their ancestors but also to a sense of cosmic order, where justice reflected harmony between human life and the natural world. Though much of this tradition faded with Roman conquest and Christianization, echoes survive. Medieval Irish law codes, for example, preserved elements of earlier Celtic practice, embedding oral memory into written form. Even now, the idea that law can live within community memory, carried not by books but by people, reminds us that justice is not only a system of rules, it is also a story told and retold, shaping how a society understands itself. Imagine the court of Tangara, China, its halls filled with carved pillars, incense drifting through silk-draped chambers, and the steady rhythm of scholars reciting texts. Within this world rose Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to claim the title of emperor. Her ascent was unusual, marked by both political calculation and an unshakable will, yet her reign was defined not only by power but by reform. Wu recognized the strength of ideas as much as armies. She expanded the civil service examinations, opening paths of advancement based not solely on aristocratic birth but on learning and ability. Imagine young scholars, brush in hand, copying passages of Confucian classics by lamplight, their futures tied to the precision of ink strokes and the clarity of their arguments. For many outside the noble clans, her policies offered the first glimpse of opportunity within the machinery of government. She also restructured administration, reducing the dominance of entrenched families and placing loyal officials in key posts. Records describe her as both demanding and meticulous, expecting efficiency in taxation and careful management of the empire's vast resources. Temples rose in her honor, yet so too did schools and projects that reflected her belief in education as the backbone of stability. Her image remains contested. To some, she was ruthless, remembered for silencing rivals and consolidating power through fear. To others, she was a visionary who widened participation in governance and proved that rule need not be bound by gender. Even now, her legacy is debated, a reminder that power often carries multiple shadows. Imagine her seated on the dragon throne, gazing across the grand hall, not only a woman defying tradition, but an emperor reshaping the rhythm of empire itself. Imagine yourself in the ancient city of Babylon, where the night sky stretched wide over the Euphrates, heavy with stars. High atop a ziggurat, scribes watched the heavens with steady patience, marking each movement on clay tablets. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the scratch of a stylus pressing into wet clay. These records, the Babylonian star catalogues, listed the rising and setting of constellations, the wanderings of planets, and the timing of eclipses. To the Babylonians, the sky was not only divine but measurable, a rhythm that could be observed and understood. Daily life revolved around these observations. Farmers looked to the stars to know when to sow or harvest, while priests wove celestial patterns into rituals and omens. Imagine the glow of oil lamps in temple courtyards, the murmur of prayers mingling with the careful turning of tablets drying in the warm air. Each mark was both science and faith, a way to anchor human life to the vast movements of the cosmos. Over time, these catalogues traveled beyond Babylon, carried into the hands of Greek thinkers who built their theories upon them. Hipparchus and Ptolemy refined astronomy with Babylonian data as their foundation, merging observation with geometry. Imagine the continuity. Clay tablets stored in Mesopotamian libraries becoming the backbone of Greek science, and centuries later, inspiring the very physics that would explain gravity, motion, and the orbits of planets. Even today, when astronomers chart distant galaxies with instruments far beyond Babylonian imagination, the principle remains the same. Careful watching, patient recording, trust in the sky's repeating patterns. Imagine standing on that ziggurat, the cool night wind against your face, the stars bright and endless. The same stars you see now once guided those ancient scribes, their marks in clay still echoing across millennia, shaping the way we measure the universe. Imagine yourself in the valleys of late medieval Switzerland, where alpine peaks rose above villages bound by the rhythm of herding, planting, and harvest. Life for peasants was marked by obligation. Taxes to lords, tithes to the church, and labor owed in fields that were not their own. Beneath the quiet routine lay frustration, a sense that the weight of duty pressed harder than the soil they tilled. In the 15th and 16th centuries, these pressures erupted in scattered but determined uprisings. Bands of peasants gathered in alpine meadows or market squares, demanding relief from debt, fairer rents, and the recognition of their communal rights. Picture farmers marching with simple tools turned into weapons, their banners painted with images of justice and faith. The revolts were not vast armies but local surges of defiance, carried on the conviction that ordinary people deserved a voice in how they lived. Lords and magistrates responded with suppression, yet each uprising left a trace, a memory that could not be erased. These struggles prefigured the language of equality that would later echo in Europe's democratic revolutions. Though many of the revolts failed in their immediate aims, their spirit endured. Imagine the persistence of families passing down stories of defiance by firesides, of communities quietly preserving traditions of self-rule in village councils. In these forgotten risings, one sees the roots of liberty emerging not from grand courts or battlefields, but from the soil and sweat of common life. The Swiss peasant uprisings remind us that the pursuit of justice often begins quietly, in the places most overlooked, carried forward by those whose voices history seldom records yet whose struggles shaped its course. Imagine yourself on the waterfront of Venice in the 15th century. The salty air carries the sound of hammers striking iron, saws rasping through timber, and the low murmur of hundreds of craftsmen at work. This is the Venetian arsenal, a vast complex where ships for the Republic's fleet were built with astonishing speed and precision. Wooden hulls, sails, ropes, and weapons were produced in an organized sequence, each step performed by skilled hands trained for a specific task. The arsenal scale was so immense that visitors compared it to a small city within a city. Daily life inside this hub was defined by rhythm and repetition. Blacksmiths tended roaring forges, shaping nails and anchors. Rope-makers walked long halls, twisting fibers into endless cords. Carpenters worked side by side, shaping planks to fit perfectly into waiting frames. Imagine walking down a corridor where each stage of construction unfolded like stations on a line, culminating in a finished galley ready to launch into the lagoon. This method, assigning tasks, standardizing parts, and coordinating labor, allowed Venice to produce ships at a pace that astonished its rivals. The arsenal was more than a workplace, it was the beating heart of Venetian power. The speed at which galleys could be assembled meant that the Republic could respond swiftly to threats, protecting its trade networks across the Mediterranean. It was, in effect, an early vision of mass production, centuries before the factories of the Industrial Revolution. Though the arsenal's clamor has long since quieted, its legacy endures. The idea that complex goods could be produced efficiently through organized division of labor shaped the future of manufacturing. Each modern assembly line, from textile mills to automobile plants, carries a quiet echo of those Venetian docks where wood, fire, and water came together to build the engines of an empire. Imagine yourself among the arid cliffs near the Dead Sea, where caves open like quiet mouths in the stone. In 1947, a young shepherd searching for a stray goat stumbled into one of these hollows and found jars filled with ancient scrolls. What he uncovered would change the study of religion forever. These fragments, now called the Dead Sea Scrolls, contain some of the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts, alongside prayers, rules, and writings of a Jewish sect that lived more than 2,000 years ago. Picture the life of that community, often thought to be the Essenes. Men dwelling in sparse stone buildings, their days structured by ritual meals, copying sacred texts by lamplight, and immersing in water for purification. The air would have been thick with the smell of parchment, ink, and desert dust. Their scrolls preserved not only scripture but commentary and community rules, reflecting a people striving to live in absolute devotion. For modern scholars, these manuscripts opened a window into the world from which both Judaism and Christianity emerged. Familiar biblical passages appeared with subtle variations, showing that sacred texts were not fixed but evolving, shaped by the hands of scribes and the beliefs of their communities. Alongside them were apocalyptic writings, describing visions of cosmic battles and divine judgment, revealing the intensity of expectation that marked the era. Today, the scrolls remain a subject of study and debate, fragile yet enduring links between ancient faith and modern understanding. Imagine holding a fragment of parchment, its ink faded but still legible, carrying across millennia the words once whispered in desert gatherings. In their echoes, you sense how belief, like the scroll itself, is never static. It unfolds, layer by layer, shaping the way generations seek meaning. Imagine the islands of Hawaii centuries ago, where ocean waves broke endlessly on black lava shores and taro fields shimmered with water under the sun. Life here was guided not only by the demands of land and sea, but by an intricate framework of sacred laws known as the kapu system. These rules, woven into daily rhythm, shaped how people fished, farmed, worshipped, and even shared meals. Kapu, meaning forbidden or sacred, marked the boundaries between the ordinary and the divine. Certain foods, like bananas or pork, were restricted to men, while women maintained their own rituals apart. Fishing grounds could be declared kapu during spawning seasons, ensuring that ocean life endured. Imagine villagers pausing at the shore, nets resting at their sides, respecting the unseen line between what was allowed and what was set aside for renewal. The system extended beyond resources to human behavior. Some spaces, heiau or temples, were so sacred that stepping within them without permission carried the threat of death. Social order itself was reinforced through kapu, linking chiefs to gods and binding the community in shared reverence. Though strict, these laws carried an ecological wisdom, aligning survival with respect for the land and sea. Over time, as outside influences arrived, the kapu system was broken, its prohibitions lifted. Yet its spirit never fully disappeared. Today, echoes remain in cultural revival, in chants and hula, in the deep respect for Aina, the land, as living ancestor. Imagine standing at a shoreline at dusk, waves folding softly against stone, feeling the quiet persistence of a law that once governed every breath and gesture, still whispering through the fabric of Hawaiian identity. Imagine yourself stepping into a Zoroastrian fire temple, the stone walls cool against the desert heat outside. In the stillness of the chamber, a flame burns steadily at the center, its glow reflected in polished bronze vessels. The air is thick with the scent of incense, smoke rising in delicate spirals toward the ceiling. This fire is not ordinary. It is tended with reverence, kept alive through unbroken care. For the followers of Zoroastrianism, the flame symbolized purity, truth, and the presence of the divine. Daily life revolved around these temples in ancient Persia. Priests in white robes carried bundles of dry wood, their movements slow and deliberate, ensuring no impurity touched the sacred fire. Imagine the rhythm of their work, the quiet crackle of burning logs, the faint ringing of ritual instruments, the murmur of prayers in the ancient Avestan tongue. Villagers and nobles alike came to stand in the glow, drawing strength and comfort from the belief that the eternal flame connected their world with higher order and light. These temples were not only spiritual centers but also cultural anchors. Festivals and rituals synchronized communities, reminding them of the eternal struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. The fire, carefully preserved, was a living reminder of this balance. Imagine the way its warmth cut through the chill of night, or how its glow steadied the hearts of travelers seeking blessing before long journeys. Even today, Zoroastrian fire temples still stand, their flames maintained across centuries. The symbolism lingers far beyond them, echoing in modern traditions that associate light with purity, wisdom, and renewal. When candles are lit in sacred spaces or torches carried in ceremonies, they echo the ancient idea that light reveals truth and pushes back shadows. Imagine yourself again before that sacred flame, its glow steady and timeless, a reminder that across cultures and centuries, humanity has always turned to light as a guide through darkness. Imagine yourself high in the Andes, where thin air carries the scent of stone, lichen, and distant snow. Across mountains, valleys, and deserts stretched the Inca road system, a network so vast and precise that it rivaled the achievements of Rome. More than 20,000 miles of paved paths connected the empire, binding together distant provinces with a steady rhythm of runners, caravans, and armies. These roads were not made for wheels but for feet and hooves, their narrow paths clinging to cliffsides, their bridges of woven grass swaying gently over roaring rivers. Picture messengers known as chaskis, sprinting in relays to deliver knotted quipu records or the words of rulers, their voices carrying news across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Imagine llama caravans stepping carefully along flagstone paths, carrying maize, textiles, and coca leaves from one ecological zone to another. The roads were arteries of empire, sustaining both daily survival and imperial ambition. Along them rose tambos, way stations where travelers could rest, store supplies, and prepare for the next stretch of the journey. Centuries later, fragments of these roads still endure, their stones weathered but intact, testimony to a civilization that saw geography not as obstacle but as canvas. The Inca networks reveal how engineering, logistics, and vision could knit together landscapes as harsh as they were beautiful. Imagine walking a quiet stretch today, the silence broken only by wind, yet knowing each stone once echoed with countless footsteps. The Inca roads remind us that power often depends not on monuments alone, but on the unseen infrastructure that carries people, goods, and ideas across the vastness of the world. Imagine yourself inside a cool stone abbey, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth, yeast, and slowly fermenting grain. In the stillness of medieval cloisters, monks tended not only to prayer but also to the practical work of survival. Brewing became one of their crafts, perfected over generations with patience and care. Copper kettles bubbled over fires, while wooden casks lined dark cellars, each holding beer that would nourish travelers, peasants, and the monks themselves. Daily life in these monasteries revolved around rhythm. Prayers marked the hours, but between them, brothers ground malt, stirred vats, and recorded recipes with meticulous notes. Imagine the quiet chatter of monks in woolen robes as they shared bread and ale at long wooden tables, the drink not only sustaining them but also considered safer than water drawn from questionable wells. Brewing was both necessity and devotion, an extension of their vow to serve community and God. The monasteries refined techniques that shaped brewing traditions still familiar today. They experimented with herbs and, later, hops to balance flavor and preserve beer for longer storage. They measured carefully, standardizing practices at a time when most food and drink varied wildly from one household to another. For weary pilgrims or villagers, the monastery ale offered not only sustenance but also a sense of trust in its quality. The echoes of this legacy continue. Many modern breweries trace inspiration back to monastic methods, some still operated by orders whose traditions stretch across centuries. The idea that brewing could be both craft and culture, sustenance and symbol, was born in these quiet abbeys. What began as a humble practice of survival has rippled outward, becoming part of the culinary identity of entire regions, reminding us that even in silence, innovation can endure. Imagine yourself on the wide plains of ancient Persia, where wind moves softly through tall grasses and hooves drum a steady rhythm against the earth. Out of the horizon comes a wave of horsemen, the Parthians, masters of a tactic that unsettled empires. They were famed for their horse archers, warriors who could gallop at full speed, wheel suddenly, and shoot arrows backward with deadly accuracy. This maneuver, remembered as the Parthian shot, became a symbol of both skill and deception, reshaping how battles were fought. Life among the Parthians revolved around mobility. Imagine the daily training of a young rider, learning to balance without saddle or stirrup, his bow always within reach. Herding, hunting, and war blurred together in a culture where survival depended on speed and precision. Unlike the heavy infantry of Rome, the Parthian forces thrived in openness and fluidity, turning the battlefield into shifting lines rather than fixed fronts. One of their most famous encounters came at Carrhae in 53 BCE, where a Roman army, disciplined and massive, marched into the desert. The Parthian horse archers harried them endlessly, loosing arrows from a distance, retreating, and striking again. The Romans, burdened by armor and unprepared for such mobility, faltered against this constant pressure. The defeat sent ripples across the Mediterranean, reminding even the most powerful empire of the dangers of underestimating new tactics. Though centuries have passed, echoes of Parthian methods linger. Mounted archery influenced medieval cavalry, nomadic warfare across Asia, and even principles of modern maneuver warfare, where speed, adaptability, and precision matter more than sheer mass. Standing in that desert wind, you can almost sense the tension of a drawn bow, the fleeting moment when skill and motion fused, leaving behind a strategy that still whispers across battlefields today. Imagine the Red Sea in late antiquity, where ships with tall masts moved slowly across the horizon, their sails filled with warm winds carrying them toward harbors thick with spice, ivory, and silk. On the Ethiopian plateau above these waters thrived the kingdom of Aksum, a Christian empire whose reach extended across Africa, Arabia, and into the networks that bound Rome to India. Though often overlooked in world histories, Aksum stood as a pillar in the web of ancient trade. Its capital, near today's Aksum, was marked by towering stone steely carved with geometric patterns, monuments that watched over a city humming with exchange. Merchants arrived from across the known world, bringing pepper from India, glassware from Rome, and gold from Africa's interior. In return, Aksum exported ivory, obsidian, and exotic animals, treasures that fed the imaginations of distant courts. Imagine the sound of coins struck in Aksumite mints, some bearing the Christian cross, a quiet assertion of faith carried into global circulation. Religion and trade intertwined. By the 4th century, Aksum's rulers embraced Christianity, building churches that echoed with chants in Guizi, while still welcoming traders of many faiths. The empire's location allowed it to mediate between cultures, a crossroads where goods and ideas converged. In marketplaces, one might hear Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and local tongues blending into the hum of commerce. Over time, shifting trade routes and environmental pressures dimmed Aksum's prominence, yet its legacy endures. The spread of Christianity in Ethiopia, the survival of ancient churches carved from rock, and the memory of its coins found far from home remind us of a kingdom once central to the world's exchange. Imagine standing among the stelae today, the air still and dry, and sensing how this hidden empire once linked distant worlds through faith and trade. Imagine yourself in a monastery in 9th century Bulgaria, where the glow of oil lamps falls across fresh parchment. Two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, have given shape to a new alphabet designed to capture the sounds of Slavic speech. Monks bend low over their desks, dipping quills into ink, carefully forming letters never before written. The air smells of parchment and smoke, and with every stroke, spoken language becomes visible, preserved, and powerful. Daily life in Bulgaria at that time was steeped in change. Villages echoed with Slavic songs, marketplaces with the barter of grain and livestock, yet the people longed for texts in their own tongue. Imagine hearing scripture read not in Greek or Latin but in words familiar from childhood. This shift gave ordinary listeners a sense of belonging, linking faith and identity through language. The alphabet was more than a tool, it was a bridge between community and culture. From these beginnings grew the Cyrillic script, carried across Slavic lands by disciples and kings who recognized its unifying power. Over centuries, it became more than writing. It became a marker of identity. Imagine scrolls carried on horseback through forests and rivers, letters spreading with religion, law, and poetry. As kingdoms rose and fell, the alphabet endured, quietly binding generations together. Even today, the Cyrillic script shapes much of Eastern Europe and beyond. It is found on street signs in Moscow, in textbooks in Sofia, in digital messages sent across the globe. Its survival shows how a written form can anchor identity, politics, and belonging. Imagine once more those monks tracing unfamiliar letters by lamplight, unaware that their careful strokes would ripple outward, shaping nations and cultures for more than 1,000 years. Imagine yourself in the heart of the Roman Forum, where merchants, citizens, and magistrates mingled among marble columns and crowded stalls. In the 5th century BCE, the people of Rome demanded something new, laws not whispered among elites but written for all to see. The result was the 12 tables, carved into bronze and set in public view. For the first time, ordinary Romans could point to fixed rules governing property, contracts, and punishment. No longer would justice depend entirely on memory or the favor of the powerful. The law had been etched into permanence, its words carrying the weight of both protection and restraint. Picture a dispute between neighbors over a boundary wall. Instead of relying on shifting testimony, both could appeal to the tables, where precise codes dictated outcomes. Imagine a father invoking his rights over inheritance, or a creditor citing the law in matters of debt. Though harsh by modern standards, allowing, for example, enslavement for unpaid debts, the very existence of codified law created a structure that bound citizens together under shared rules. The legacy of the 12 tables extended far beyond Rome. They shaped the evolution of Roman law, influencing jurists, emperors, and, eventually, the legal traditions that spread through Europe and beyond. The principle that laws must be written, accessible, and stable echoes today in constitutions, courtrooms, and civic life across the globe. Imagine yourself running your hand along a bronze tablet, the characters worn but still legible, a reminder that societies have always sought order through words carved into permanence. The 12 tables stand not only as artifacts of their time but as enduring shadows beneath modern justice. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a deep cenote in the Yucatan, its waters shimmering dark and still beneath overhanging limestone cliffs. The air is heavy with humidity, scented faintly of wet stone and jungle blooms. For the ancient Maya, such sinkholes were more than natural formations. They were portals to the underworld, sacred places where offerings were cast to honor gods and seek favor. Gold ornaments, jade beads, woven textiles, even food and incense were lowered or thrown into the depths, vanishing into the cool water with soft splashes. Daily life around these cenotes reflected reverence and routine. Farmers might bring maize or cacao to leave as gifts, while rulers and priests oversaw more elaborate ceremonies. Imagine the quiet anticipation of a gathered crowd, the smoke of burning copal drifting upward as priests chanted, their voices echoing against stone walls. In rare and solemn moments, human lives were given, a practice both feared and revered, underscoring the belief that these waters connected the living with unseen powers. For archaeologists today, the cenotes are time capsules. Diverse retrieve offerings preserved in silt, ceramic vessels, jewelry, bones, that speak of devotion and the weight of belief. Each artifact tells a fragment of a story, a reminder that rituals were not simply acts of superstition, but carefully structured traditions binding communities to cycles of rain, fertility, and survival. The legacy of the cenotes still resonates. Tourists now swim in their clear waters, unaware that beneath lies a history of reverence and sacrifice. For the Maya, these places embodied the meeting of worlds, surface and underworld, human and divine. What remains is the quiet lesson that landscapes themselves can become sacred, carrying meaning long after the rituals have ended. Imagine yourself in the streets of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The air is warm, the narrow lanes crowded with merchants, bakers, and townsfolk carrying out the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Then, without warning, a woman steps into the square and begins to dance. Her movements are frantic, unrelenting, and soon others join her. Day after day, dozens of people move without rest, their bodies driven by something no one can explain. This strange event, remembered as the dancing plague, unfolded not as festival or joy, but as exhaustion and fear. Accounts describe dancers collapsing from fatigue, their feet raw against the cobblestones, yet rising again as if compelled. Imagine the sound of shoes striking stone, a ceaseless rhythm echoing through the city, baffling both onlookers and authorities. Physicians of the time offered explanations tied to humors and blood, while clergy suggested divine punishment. Some townspeople even built stages and brought musicians, hoping that if the dancers played out the madness, it would pass. Instead, the movement spread, until hundreds were caught in its grip. Modern scholars still debate its cause. Some suggest ergot poisoning from moldy grain, others point to psychological stress, famine, disease, and social strain creating a collective breakdown expressed through uncontrollable motion. Whatever its roots, the episode reveals something enduring about human societies. The mind and body can mirror collective fears in ways that defy reason. The dancers of Strasbourg eventually faded back into silence, leaving behind only chronicles and questions. Today, their story is remembered less as an oddity and more as a glimpse into the mysteries of shared psychology. Imagine that square, now quiet, where centuries ago the cobblestones bore witness to a dance no one chose, a movement that revealed how fragile and connected the human mind can be. Imagine the narrow canals of 17th-century Amsterdam, lined with tall houses of brick, their gables reflected in quiet water. In this thriving republic, trade wealth flowed in from across the globe, spices, textiles, and silver. But amid this abundance, a flower became the unlikely center of fortune and speculation. Tulips, with their fragile petals streaked in vivid colors, grew into symbols of status so coveted that their bulbs were traded as if they were gold. At first, The trade was simple. Rare varieties exchanged among wealthy collectors who admired their beauty in carefully tended gardens. But soon contracts emerged, promises to deliver bulbs not yet grown, their prices rising with every transaction. Imagine crowded taverns, where merchants unrolled slips of paper detailing future tulips, voices low as wagers were made, values climbing to heights that seemed unmoored from the soil itself. By the winter of 1637, the bubble stretched thin. A single bulb of the rarest kind might equal the price of a fine house. Yet when buyers hesitated, fear spread quickly. Promises collapsed, contracts became worthless, and fortunes vanished overnight. Farmers still dug bulbs from the earth, but what had been priceless one season lay unwanted the next. The tulip crash did not destroy the Dutch Republic, but it left a cautionary imprint. Economists still look back to it as one of the earliest bubbles, a reminder that markets can be swept by desire as much as reason. Picture a tulip blooming in spring light, delicate, fleeting, a beauty never meant to carry the weight of empires. In its short life, it reflects both the wonder and the fragility of human wealth. Imagine yourself in an Armenian village in the early 20th century, where daily life once followed the rhythm of church bells, market gatherings, and family meals. That rhythm was shattered in 1915, when the Ottoman Empire began a campaign that would scatter, silence, and destroy countless Armenian communities. The genocide claimed over 1 million lives, yet what followed was not only death, but silence, a silence that lingered for decades, heavy and unresolved. Daily life for survivors became an act of remembering while being forced to forget. Families carried fragments of stories across borders, preserving songs, recipes, and whispered accounts. Imagine a grandmother telling her grandchildren about orchards left behind, her voice trembling, yet stopping short of describing the violence in detail. In exile, Armenians built new homes in foreign cities, their identity reshaped by loss, and their voices often unheard in the wider world. The tragedy was not only in what happened, but in how the world responded. For many years, recognition was absent, and the silence around the genocide deepened wounds. This denial became another form of erasure, compounding grief with invisibility. Imagine walking through streets where history books omit your story, or hearing leaders debate whether your suffering even deserves acknowledgement. Today, the Armenian genocide remains a touchstone in discussions of human rights, memory, and justice. Recognition has grown, but debates continue, reflecting the enduring weight of silence. The lesson it leaves is stark, that forgetting is dangerous, and that silence can be as destructive as violence itself. Imagine standing before a memorial flame in Yerevan, the air still, the stone cold, and realizing that the act of remembering is itself resistance, a way of breaking silence so that such tragedies are neither ignored nor repeated. Imagine yourself on the Mediterranean coast nearly 3,000 years ago, where the salty breeze carries the scent of brine and smoke from coastal workshops. Here, the Phoenicians discovered and perfected a craft that would ripple across cultures, the making of purple dye. Drawn painstakingly from the glands of tiny sea snails, each drop required countless shells, boiled and processed until the liquid deepened into a vivid, lasting hue. The labor was so immense, and the color so striking, that purple soon became more than a dye. It became a language of power, worn by kings, priests, and later emperors. Picture a merchant in Tyre, his storerooms filled with amphorae sealed tight, each carrying fabric stained with the hue that seemed to hold the dusk sky. To wear it was not only to display wealth but to claim authority, a visible marker that set rulers apart from their subjects. The dye traveled along trade routes, stitched into garments in distant courts, its symbolism spreading as steadily as its commerce. For the Phoenicians, purple was both livelihood and legacy. Their mastery of the seas brought them wealth, but their mastery of this color embedded them in the very symbolism of power for millennia. Imagine yourself unrolling a fragment of cloth today, its faded fibers still clinging to traces of that once vivid shade. In that small thread lies a story of how luxury became identity, how color itself could shape human imagination. The Phoenician purple dye reminds us that sometimes the rarest resources are not metals or stones, but but the ability to transform nature into meaning that endures through time. Imagine yourself in an ancient Indian court during the Gupta Empire, sometime around the 4th century. The air is warm, filled with the murmur of scholars gathered in shaded courtyards, palm leaf manuscripts spread before them. Ink made from soot and plant resin stains their fingers as they carefully record numbers, symbols that, though simple, carried a revolutionary power. Here, the concept of zero as both a placeholder and a number in its own right was refined, alongside the decimal system that arranged values in a clear hierarchy of tens. What seems ordinary to us today was, in that time, a quiet marvel. Daily life for those scholars was a steady rhythm of study, debate, and teaching. Imagine students seated cross-legged on woven mats, repeating calculations aloud, their voices blending with the sounds of distant temple bells. Merchants used these innovations to track trade, weighing spices, cloth, or gold with precision previously impossible. The rhythm of markets, the fairness of exchange, the ability to plan beyond immediate barter, all became easier under this new system of numbers. The decimal framework soon traveled beyond India's borders. Arab scholars adopted and transmitted it, carrying the knowledge into Persia, North Africa, and eventually Europe. Imagine the transformation centuries later, when medieval accountants or architects, using the same system, found complex calculations suddenly more manageable. Cathedrals rose, navigation improved, and trade expanded, all resting on a foundation of numbers born in Gupta India. Today, every equation solved, every bank transaction processed, every digital code written still leans on this same structure. The legacy of the Gupta decimal system is not seen in monuments of stone, but in the invisible architecture of modern life. It is a reminder that some of humanity's most profound achievements lie not in conquering empires, but in the clarity of an idea that endures across centuries. Imagine yourself among the rugged mountains and plateaus of Anatolia, where dry winds sweep across valleys once filled with palaces and temples. For centuries, the Hittite civilization was little more than a name in passing biblical references, its existence doubted by many. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered ruins, clay tablets, and inscriptions that revealed an empire hidden in plain sight, a kingdom that had once stood among the great powers of the ancient world. At its height in the 2nd millennium BCE, the Hittite Empire rivaled Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Imagine the rhythm of life in their capital, Hattusa. Scribes pressing cuneiform into clay, chariots rattling through city gates, priests offering sacrifices in stone sanctuaries. From this highland stronghold, the Hittite kings negotiated treaties, forged alliances, and waged wars. Their surviving records include one of the earliest known peace treaties, the agreement with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, evidence of a political vision that valued stability as much as conquest. The rediscovery of the Hittites reshaped modern understanding of statehood in the ancient world. Their archives revealed complex laws, international correspondence, and a bureaucracy that managed resources across vast territories. Far from being a forgotten people, the Hittites had been architects of diplomacy, balancing force with negotiation, shaping early ideas of how empires could coexist. Today, as you picture the carved lion gates of Hattusa or the weathered tablets covered in cuneiform signs, you can sense the quiet endurance of their legacy. The Hittites remind us that history often hides in silence until unearthed, and that concepts of treaties, alliances, and statecraft we still use today trace faint lines back to their mountain cities. Imagine the slopes of the Andes, mountains rising sharply into skies brushed with thin clouds, their ridges carved by human hands into steady steps of stone and soil. These terraces, layered like stairways climbing toward the peaks, were more than engineering marvels, they were lifelines. For centuries, Andean farmers transformed steep, unforgiving landscapes into fertile ground, creating a system that still echoes in today's conversations about sustainability. Each terrace was carefully built with retaining walls, filled with layers of earth and gravel to manage water and prevent erosion. Rainfall and mountain streams flowed gently downward, absorbed step by step rather than lost in sudden floods. Imagine the sound of trickling water guided through channels, feeding potatoes, maize, and quinoa planted in orderly rows. The terraces not only expanded farmland but created microclimates, where altitude determined which crops would thrive. Beyond efficiency, the system reflected balance. Farming was not seen as conquering the mountain but working with it, aligning human need with natural rhythm. Communities shared labor in cycles, their collective work ensuring that no wall crumbled, no channel ran dry. The harvest was a communal achievement, reinforcing bonds as much as survival. Centuries later, many of these terraces still stand, their stone walls weathered but resilient, still holding soil against the pull of gravity. Modern agronomists study them for lessons in water management, soil preservation, and climate adaptation. Standing on those ancient steps, you sense not only the ingenuity of past farmers but the quiet persistence of an idea that human survival flourishes best when built in harmony with the earth itself. Imagine yourself in 18th-century Prussia, where discipline shaped not only armies but the very rhythm of society. Within stark stone buildings, young cadets filed into halls lit by tall windows, their boots striking in unison on wooden floors. These were the Prussian military schools, places where precision, obedience, and methodical instruction were instilled from childhood. Lessons were not only about weapons or tactics, but about order itself, carried out through daily drills and the steady voice of instructors who valued structure above all. Daily life within these schools blended study with regimented routine. Imagine mornings beginning with inspection, uniforms brushed and buttons polished to reflect the light. Hours of marching alternated with lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic, for an educated soldier was seen as a more effective one. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and ink, while outside, the yards echoed with the rhythm of coordinated drills. Each day repeated itself with little variation, creating a pattern as strict and predictable as a clock. Over time, this approach to training reached far beyond the military. Civil administrators and reformers admired the system's efficiency and adopted its methods for broader education. The emphasis on timetables, standardized lessons, and teacher authority shaped schools across Europe and eventually much of the world. Imagine children in distant cities, centuries later, rising at the sound of bells, sitting in rows, and absorbing knowledge through routines inspired, in part, by those Prussian halls. Today, when we step into classrooms structured by order and repetition, we are seeing echoes of this legacy. What began as preparation for disciplined soldiers evolved into a model for disciplined citizens. Imagine again those young cadets, their voices reciting lessons in unison, unaware that the patterns of their schooling would ripple outward, shaping education far beyond the borders of Prussia, lasting into the present. Imagine yourself in a small New England village in 1692, where narrow wooden houses leaned against fields, and the air was thick with suspicion as much as with wood smoke. Salem was a community on edge. Harsh winters, frontier wars, and fragile crops had left its people anxious, searching for order in a world they could not fully control. When strange fits and accusations began among young girls, the fear took root quickly. Whispers of witchcraft spread through churches and households, and the community's unease turned into a tide of paranoia. Picture neighbors turning against one another, long-standing grievances wrapped suddenly in the language of sorcery. Courts filled with testimony built on fear rather than fact, and the words of children carried more weight than evidence. Those accused found themselves trapped in a system where denial was itself seen as proof of guilt. The gallows, built on a low hill, became the final stage of a tragedy that consumed dozens of lives. Yet even as the hysteria faded, its shadow lingered. Imagine the silence in the village once the trials ended, the empty chairs in homes, the uneasy awareness that fear had unmade justice. In the centuries since, Salem has become both caution and symbol. Its story warns of what happens when collective anxiety overrides reason, when societies allow suspicion to harden into law. The Salem witch trials are not only about the past but about the enduring fragility of communities under strain. They remind us that paranoia can shape identity as much as triumph, and that the search for order can sometimes lead directly into chaos. Imagine yourself on an open plain in Aotearoa, New Zealand, centuries ago. The ground is firm beneath your feet, the air carrying the scent of earth and sea mingled with wood smoke. A group of Maori warriors gather, their voices rising in unison, their feet stamping against the soil in a rhythm that seems to echo through the land itself. Faces are marked with moko, eyes wide, tongues thrust forward, arms slapping chests and thighs. This is the haka, a sacred ritual of preparation, a dance of strength and unity meant to summon courage and unnerve opponents before battle. Daily life among Maori communities wove these traditions into more than warfare. Imagine a village gathering for a birth, a marriage, or the welcoming of guests, where the haka took on tones of celebration and honor. The chants carried genealogies and ancestral memory, binding the living to those who came before. For participants, the haka was not mere performance but embodiment, a way to feel history coursing through the body, breath by breath, step by step. Colonial encounters threatened to silence such expressions, yet the haka endured, preserved through oral tradition and practice. Over time, it shifted from battlefield to cultural stage, finding new life as a symbol of identity and resilience. Today, it is perhaps most widely recognized in the haka performed by New Zealand's rugby teams, their voices and movements commanding respect on fields far from their homeland. Yet beneath its modern visibility lies the same essence. The haka is a vessel of memory, a declaration of presence, a reminder that culture is carried not only in words or objects but in movement and sound. Its survival speaks to the power of tradition to adapt while holding fast to its roots, commanding attention across centuries and continents. Imagine yourself on the cold shores of Greenland around the year 1000, where Norse settlers built small farmsteads against a backdrop of ice and sea. The air carried the sharp scent of salt and peat smoke, while hardy cattle grazed on sparse grass. These communities, founded by Eric the Red and his followers, were distant outposts of the Viking world, places where people sought to recreate the rhythms of life in Iceland and Norway, even at the edge of the habitable world. For centuries, the colonies endured. Imagine the daily routines: farmers tending sheep and goats, women weaving wool into thick cloth, and traders loading ships with walrus ivory, a prized commodity in medieval Europe. Churches rose from the rocky ground, their bells carrying across the fjords, reminders that even here faith anchored community life. Yet survival was always fragile. The climate began to cool during the period known as the Little Ice Age, shortening growing seasons and thickening the sea ice that connected Greenland to trade routes abroad. Archaeological evidence shows dwindling herds, abandoned houses, and bones marked with signs of hunger. Contact with Europe grew irregular, and goods once common, iron tools, cloth, even grain, became scarce. Some suggest conflict with the Inuit or disease contributed, but no single cause explains the quiet disappearance. By the 15th century, the Norse Greenlanders had vanished, leaving only ruins and silent fjords behind. Their story carries echoes for today. The Viking settlers remind us how human communities depend on climate, trade, and adaptability. Standing among their crumbling churches and empty farm sites, you sense a cautionary tale, that even the most resilient societies can fade when the world around them shifts faster than they can adjust. Imagine the heat of the Egyptian sun in 1799, when French soldiers, digging near the Nile, uncovered a slab of dark granite. Its surface was carved with rows of text, 3 scripts etched in careful lines: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. At first, it seemed only a fragment of a decree, but in time, this stone would unlock the language of pharaohs and reshape the study of the ancient world. For centuries, hieroglyphs had remained silent. Temples and tombs stood covered in symbols: birds, eyes, serpents, yet no one could read their meaning. The Rosetta Stone offered a key, the same message written in 3 scripts, one of them Greek, already known to scholars. Imagine the patience of study, as words were compared line by line, scholars leaning over copies of the text by candlelight, tracing connections across centuries. It was Jean-François Champollion, after years of work, who finally cracked the code in the 1820s. By recognizing that hieroglyphs combined sound and symbol, he began to hear once again the voices carved into stone walls. Names of rulers, prayers to gods, and records of daily life emerged, turning silent ruins into a living archive of a lost civilization. The stone itself remains a symbol of translation, not only between languages, but between ages. Standing before it today in a museum's quiet hall, you see more than granite. You see a bridge, linking the present to the distant past, reminding us that memory can sleep for centuries and still be awakened by persistence, patience, and the careful reading of signs. Imagine yourself in a quiet Japanese village centuries ago. The air is cool, the wooden floors of a samurai household polished smooth by generations of footsteps. A warrior kneels in silence, his sword resting nearby, yet his attention is fixed not on battle but on words. These words are the hidden codes of Bushido, the way of the warrior, a philosophy that shaped conduct through loyalty, discipline, and honor. Though rarely written in rigid form, the code lived in gestures, decisions, and the rhythm of daily life. Daily routines reflected this philosophy as much as the battlefield did. Imagine the samurai rising before dawn, practicing calligraphy with the same care he gave to his blade, or pausing in a garden where the sound of wind in bamboo reminded him of restraint. Meals were simple, conversations measured, each act infused with awareness of duty to family, clan, and lord. The code was less a set of commands and more a quiet compass, guiding life even when swords remained sheathed. Bushido also carried contradictions, demanding loyalty even when it meant personal sacrifice, valuing honesty while accepting silence in service of greater order. These tensions gave the code depth, ensuring it endured beyond the era of samurai rule. Imagine merchants and scholars centuries later recalling the samurai's discipline, weaving fragments of the code into evolving forms of leadership and ethics. Even today, echoes of Bushido linger. In Japan's corporate culture, where loyalty to a company often mirrors loyalty to a lord, or in global ideals of integrity and honor, the quiet influence of this warrior philosophy endures. Imagine once more that warrior in his garden, the flame of a lantern flickering at dusk, his thoughts balanced between strength and humility. His code, though hidden in time, continues to illuminate the ways people seek dignity and purpose in the modern world. Imagine yourself walking across the vast Australian landscape, red earth stretching to the horizon, eucalyptus leaves stirring in dry wind, the night sky layered with countless stars. For Aboriginal peoples, this land was not empty space but a living map, carried not on paper but in memory and voice. Songlines or dreaming tracks were oral maps that traced the journeys of ancestral beings, embedding geography, waterholes, and sacred sites into story and rhythm. To sing a songline was to navigate, to pass on ecological knowledge, and to reaffirm bonds between people and land. Picture a traveler moving silently across hundreds of miles, guided not by compass but by melody. The rising tone of a verse might mark a hill, the shift of rhythm a river crossing, the repetition of a phrase a reminder of where food or shelter could be found. These oral maps were both practical and spiritual, entwining survival with ceremony. Knowledge of place was carried in language, in breath, in the cadence of songs that connected communities across vast distances. Even today, songlines endure, not only as cultural heritage but as vital sources of ecological wisdom. They preserve insights into water systems, seasonal cycles, and species relationships, offering perspectives increasingly valued in modern environmental management. Imagine listening to an elder's voice carrying a melody that is also a map, a record of place sustained across tens of thousands of years. Songlines remind us that knowledge need not be written to endure, and that memory, story, and song can create maps more lasting than ink or stone. Imagine yourself on the South African veldt at the turn of the 20th century. The horizon stretches wide, a plain of tall grass broken by rocky outcrops and scattered acacia trees. In this landscape, Boer fighters, farmers turned soldiers, moved with quiet precision. Their horses carried them swiftly across familiar ground, rifles slung over shoulders, saddlebags filled with simple provisions. Unlike the rigid formations of European armies, these men relied on mobility, surprise, and knowledge of terrain. From rocky ridges they fired, then disappeared into the open land before their opponents could respond. Daily life in these guerrilla bands was stripped to its essentials. Camps were temporary, little more than fires in the night and blankets rolled tightly against the cold. Food was sparse, scavenged or supplied by sympathetic families. Imagine the tension of silence before a dawn raid, the sharp crack of gunfire breaking stillness, followed by the hurried retreat into endless veldt. What sustained them was not wealth or supplies, but determination to resist an empire far stronger in numbers and arms. Their struggle during the Anglo-Boer Wars foreshadowed patterns that would echo into the modern era. The reliance on small, fast-moving groups, the use of local knowledge to counter conventional armies, and the blending of civilian and soldier blurred the boundaries of traditional war. For the British, accustomed to straight lines and set-piece battles, these tactics were confounding, forcing adaptations in strategy and revealing the limits of conventional power. The legacy of Boer guerrilla warfare endures in the history of resistance. Later movements across the world, from liberation struggles to asymmetric conflicts, carried lessons first tested in the South African veldt. What began as farmers defending their homeland became part of the larger story of how modern conflict evolved, not always won by strength alone, but by flexibility, patience, and the quiet knowledge of the land. Imagine yourself walking through the jungles of Cambodia, where towering trees now conceal stone temples and silent reservoirs. In the 12th century, this was the heart of the Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor, a city sustained not only by its monuments but by one of the most intricate water management systems the pre-modern world had ever seen. Canals, reservoirs, and embankments stretched across the landscape, capturing monsoon rains and distributing them with astonishing precision. Daily life depended on this hydraulic web. Imagine farmers guiding oxen through wet fields, their crops thriving because water flowed steadily even in dry months. Massive barrages, rectangular reservoirs the size of small lakes, stored seasonal rains, while a network of canals directed the flow into rice paddies, ensuring harvests that fed hundreds of thousands. This system allowed the Khmer Empire to flourish for centuries, supporting monumental projects like Angkor Wat, where stone towers rose above a city sustained by invisible rivers of human ingenuity. Yet this achievement also carried fragility. Shifts in climate, with alternating floods and droughts, strained the system. Sediment clogged canals, reservoirs fell into disrepair, and the careful balance between abundance and scarcity was lost. As the waterworks faltered, so too did the empire's stability, leaving behind majestic ruins that nature slowly reclaimed. Today, archaeologists and engineers study anchors remains to understand how water shaped not only a city but an entire civilization. Standing before those vast empty reservoirs, you sense both the brilliance and the warning of the Khmer legacy, that human societies, however advanced, are bound to the rhythms of water. In their silent canals lies a forgotten lesson, one that resonates deeply in a world once again grappling with scarcity and flood. Imagine the Mediterranean Sea 2,000 years ago, its surface dotted with sails, the salty wind carrying the scent of pine tar and fish. Among the greatest seafaring powers of this world stood Carthage, a city of traders and sailors, its harbors filled with ships that reached from North Africa to Spain and beyond. While much of Carthage has been lost to time, its maritime skills left ripples that shaped trade and naval warfare for centuries. The city's power grew not only from wealth but from mastery of the sea. Carthaginian shipwrights designed swift biremes and triremes, oared vessels that could maneuver with surprising agility. Their warships were built with reinforced prows, crafted to ram enemy hulls with precision. Imagine the clash of timber on open water, the rhythm of rowers keeping time, drums beating steadily as fleets advanced in formation. Yet Carthage was more than its navy. It was a hub of commerce, where tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, and spices from Africa passed through its markets. The city's famed circular harbor was divided into sections, outer docks for merchants, inner docks for warships, all organized with efficiency that astonished later observers. To walk along its quays was to encounter goods and languages from across the known world. Though Rome eventually destroyed Carthage, erasing much of its memory, echoes of its maritime power endured. Techniques of shipbuilding, strategies of naval combat, and the very idea of sea-based empires carried forward. When we think of oceans as highways of trade and arenas of war, we follow traces first charted by Carthaginian hands, still lingering like faint wakes on the ancient sea. Imagine yourself walking along the walls of a fortress by the Mediterranean coast in the 12th century. The air is heavy with salt, sails dot the horizon, and banners bearing crosses ripple in the wind. These are the Crusader states, temporary kingdoms carved from conquest, existing at the fragile edge of faith and survival. Towns like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre became uneasy meeting grounds where Latin Christians, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side, bound together as much by tension as by trade. Daily life within these states mixed the familiar with the foreign. Imagine narrow markets where spices from Arabia mingled with European fabrics, where pilgrims brushed shoulders with soldiers, and where languages overlapped in constant negotiation. Castles stood watch over fields of wheat, their stone walls echoing with the clatter of armor, while villages beyond their shadow carried on the quiet rhythm of farming and prayer. For many, life meant adapting, finding a way to live between cultures, often under the weight of fear. Though fragile, these kingdoms shaped more than their short-lived existence. They introduced new systems of fortification, fostered exchanges of knowledge, and deepened divides between faiths. Imagine a council chamber where rulers argued over alliances, torn between loyalty to distant Europe and the realities of their new land. Every decision carried consequences not just for themselves, but for the centuries of conflict that would follow. Today, the memory of the Crusader states lingers in politics, religion, and cultural identity. Their rise and fall remind us how temporary power can leave lasting fractures, how borders drawn in conquest echo long after the stones crumble. Imagine once more the sea wind against your face, the walls of Acre looming above you, and the realization that these fleeting kingdoms left shadows still visible in the struggles and dialogues of the modern world. Imagine yourself in the hills outside ancient Rome, where clear springs bubbled from stone and the air carried the cool scent of running water. From these sources began the aqueducts, long lines of arches and channels that carried life itself into the heart of the city. With patient precision, Roman engineers measured gradients so slight that water could flow for miles without faltering. Bridges of stone marched across valleys, tunnels cut through hills, all guiding streams into fountains, baths, and households. To walk beneath an aqueduct was to stand under a testament to human ingenuity, a quiet rhythm of arches stretching toward the horizon. Picture daily life in Rome shaped by this steady supply. Citizens drew water at public fountains, bathhouses thrummed with social life, and gardens bloomed in the Mediterranean sun. For many, it was easy to forget that this abundance depended on hidden channels maintained constantly by teams of workers. The aqueducts were not simply structures but systems, blending architecture, mathematics, and labor into a network that sustained nearly 1 million people. Even centuries after their construction, fragments of aqueducts still rise against the skyline, their stones weathered yet unbroken. Modern engineers still marvel at their durability, tracing principles of gradient, pressure, and flow that remain relevant in today's water systems. Imagine running your hand across ancient stone, still cool from the trickle of water that once passed within. The aqueducts remind us that civilization flourishes not only through conquests or monuments, but through the unseen infrastructures that quietly carry the necessities of life. Imagine yourself in a fertile clearing of a native village, the soil dark and warm beneath the sun. Here, rows of corn rise tall, their stalks rustling softly in the breeze. At their feet, beans wind upward, curling tendrils around the sturdy stems. Between them spread broad squash leaves, shading the ground and keeping the earth moist. This was the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, grown together in a system of balance that sustained countless communities across North America. Daily life around these fields followed seasonal rhythms. Families planted together in spring, guided by tradition and memory. Imagine the sound of wooden hoes striking soil, the smell of earth freshly turned, the quiet conversations of women and children as they pressed seeds into the ground. By summer, the fields thrummed with life, corn offering structure, beans fixing nitrogen into the soil, squash protecting roots from sun and weeds. It was agriculture shaped not by exploitation, but by cooperation, where each plant supported the others, and the people in turn were nourished by all three. The three sisters were more than food. They appeared in stories and ceremonies, symbolic of harmony and interdependence. Shared in feasts, dried for storage, carried on long journeys, they provided not only sustenance but also a model for resilience. Imagine the comfort of a meal of corn bread, bean stew, and roasted squash after a day's work, flavors both simple and enduring. Their legacy still offers lessons. Modern agriculture, with its vast monocultures and heavy reliance on chemicals, often overlooks the wisdom of diversity and balance. Yet the three sisters remind us that sustainability comes from partnership, between species, between people, and between communities and the land. What once fed villages beneath wide skies continues to inspire those who seek ways to cultivate not just crops, but lasting harmony with the earth. Imagine yourself in the city of Uruk more than 4,000 years ago, where mud brick walls rise high against the horizon and the Euphrates drifts quietly beyond the fields. In this place, stories were not bound in books but pressed into clay tablets, each wedge-shaped mark carrying memory across generations. Among these stories was the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, recounting the life of a king whose adventures blurred the line between myth and history. The rhythm of the tale unfolds through trials and questions still familiar today. Gilgamesh, strong and restless, first clashes with the wild man Enkidu, then finds in him a companion. Together they journey into cedar forests, confront divine guardians, and defy the gods. Imagine the sound of a storyteller reciting these verses by lamplight, the air heavy with smoke and silence, while listeners followed each turn of triumph and loss. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh begins a restless search for immortality, only to return with the realization that human legacy rests not in eternal life but in the walls, cities, and stories we leave behind. The epic shaped how later civilizations imagined kingship, friendship, and the struggle with mortality. Its flood narrative echoes in biblical traditions, while its themes of loss and meaning still resonate with modern readers. The text itself is fragmentary, pieced together from tablets found across Mesopotamia, yet its voice remains steady, an ancient reminder that the questions we ask about life and death are as old as civilization itself. When you trace the lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you are not only reading myth, you are touching the earliest record of human imagination, a whisper carried forward from clay into every story that followed. Imagine the shifting sands of the Arabian desert, where dunes roll endlessly beneath a blazing sun and the horizon shimmers with heat. Travelers once spoke of a city here, called Ubar, a hub of trade and wealth, its towers rising like mirages above the desert floor. Known as the Atlantis of the Sands, it was said to have thrived on the incense trade, linking Arabia with markets as distant as Rome and India. Caravans carried frankincense and myrrh from the southern highlands, winding along routes that converged at this fabled city. Imagine camels laden with goods, their bells jingling softly as traders rested at Ubar's wells, exchanging not only merchandise but stories of distant lands. The city was described as prosperous, yet prideful, until, as legend claimed, divine wrath or natural disaster brought it to ruin. For centuries, its existence blurred into myth. Some dismissed it as allegory, a warning told in Quranic verses of a people who defied righteousness. Others believed it was buried beneath sandstorms, hidden from view yet preserved in memory. Explorers searched, drawn by tales of a vanished kingdom, their maps dotted with uncertain markings and whispered names. In the late 20th century, satellite imaging and excavations uncovered ruins at a site in Oman, where collapsed limestone caverns suggested a city swallowed by the earth. Whether this was truly Ubar remains debated, but the discovery rekindled the sense of wonder. Standing amid those broken stones, one feels the quiet persistence of legend, the idea that cities may vanish from sight yet continue to live in story, inspiring each new generation to search where the desert meets the sky. Imagine yourself in an ancient Indian town where the air carries the scent of oil lamps and the slow ringing of temple bells. Monks in simple white robes walk barefoot along dusty paths, sweeping the ground before each step so as not to harm even the smallest insect. This practice comes from Ahimsa, the Jain doctrine of nonviolence, which shaped not only religious life but the rhythm of daily existence. In markets, conversations were hushed with reminders to act gently. In households, meals were prepared with care to avoid taking life unnecessarily. Daily life for Jain communities revolved around this principle. Imagine craftsmen refusing to work with animal hides, or merchants trading fairly, believing that exploitation was a form of harm. Even speech was weighed carefully, words chosen to avoid injury as much as weapons might. The doctrine created a culture where restraint was strength, and where purity meant living in harmony with all beings. Over centuries, this philosophy reached far beyond Jain temples and villages. It inspired reformers and thinkers, most famously Mahatma Gandhi, who transformed ahimsa into a principle of political resistance. Imagine Gandhi standing before crowds, his voice calm but firm, drawing strength from a tradition that had taught for millennia that true power lies in refusing to harm. Through him, and through those he influenced, Jain ideals flowed into global struggles for justice and civil rights. Even today, the doctrine of nonviolence continues to echo. Whether in movements for peace, in calls for animal welfare, or in the quiet choices of individuals, the spirit of ahimsa reminds us that restraint can be revolutionary. Imagine again those monks on their slow walks, lanterns flickering in the dusk, their every step guided by the belief that the smallest life matters. In their silence and care, you glimpse a philosophy that still shapes how humanity seeks justice without cruelty. Imagine yourself in early 19th century France, where the upheavals of revolution had torn down monarchy and tradition, leaving questions of order in their place. Into this uncertainty stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, determined not only to rule but to unify. The Napoleonic Code, drafted in 1804, sought to strip law of ambiguity and bind the nation with a clear, written system. It standardized property rights, civil contracts, and family law, emphasizing equality before the law, at least for men, while replacing the patchwork of local customs with one coherent structure. Picture a clerk copying the code into neat volumes, their pages destined for courthouses and schools across the empire. Farmers, merchants, and soldiers alike now lived under the same framework, knowing that disputes over land or inheritance would be judged by rules that no longer shifted from province to province. Beyond France, the code traveled with Napoleon's conquests, carried into Italy, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany, where its clarity and accessibility made it endure long after the empire collapsed. Its influence spread far beyond Europe. Nations from Latin America to North Africa adopted versions of the code, drawn by its rational organization and its vision of uniform citizenship. Imagine walking into a courtroom today in Paris, Brussels, or Cairo, where echoes of the code still shape proceedings. Though revised many times, its skeleton remains, a reminder that revolutions do not only topple thrones, they also etch new patterns of governance into daily life. The Napoleonic Code stands as one of history's most enduring legal exports, its orderly clauses still whispering the ideals of revolution across continents. Imagine yourself in a dim stone chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. The air is thick with the scent of heated metals, herbs, and faint smoke curling from crucibles. A medieval alchemist bends over his workbench, glass vessels and copper tools spread before him, their surfaces clouded with residue from countless trials. To his mind, the world is filled with hidden correspondences, base metals yearning to become gold, matter infused with spiritual meaning. Yet in the slow rhythm of grinding powders, distilling liquids, and carefully noting results, something deeper was unfolding. These practices, mystical though they seemed, quietly laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. Daily life for an alchemist was a blend of ritual and persistence. Imagine the steady sound of a mortar and pestle, the gentle bubbling of a flask balanced over flame, the careful turning of parchment pages filled with cryptic symbols. Though they sought transformation of materials, they also documented observations, noticing which combinations produced reactions, which methods yielded consistent results. Apprentices learned through repetition, their hands stained with ash and dye, their imaginations sparked by both failure and discovery. Though much of alchemy was bound to visions of transmutation and eternal life, its methods were practical. Distillation refined perfumes and medicines, Metallurgy advanced through constant experimentation, and dyes and glass improved in quality. Gradually, the veil of secrecy gave way to structured inquiry, and what began as esoteric pursuit became recognizable science. The legacy of alchemy endures in the very language of chemistry. Words like elixir, aqua vitae, and sublimation trace back to those early labs. More importantly, the discipline of observation, of testing and refining, shaped the path toward the scientific method. What alchemists imagined as the transformation of metals became, over centuries, the transformation of knowledge itself. Imagine yourself climbing the slopes of Mount Parnassus in ancient Greece, where the air grows thin and the path winds upward toward a sanctuary of stone. At Delphi, pilgrims arrived from across the Mediterranean, carrying offerings and questions. They sought the words of Apollo's oracle, spoken through the Pythia, a woman seated in a dim chamber above a fissure in the earth. The air was said to be heavy with vapors, her voice shifting into fragments of verse that priests shaped into responses. For centuries, rulers and commoners alike treated these utterances as the guiding breath of a god. Daily life at Delphi was a mingling of ritual and commerce. Imagine the bustle of pilgrims leading animals for sacrifice, artisans selling small statues, and priests tending fires that sent thin smoke into the mountain air. Between ceremonies, the sacred site echoed with anticipation. Questions whispered, answers awaited. The Pythia's words were often ambiguous, layered with meanings that required interpretation. A king planning war might hear both encouragement and warning, leaving him to wrestle with choice under the shadow of divine mystery. The oracle's influence reached far beyond Greece. Leaders shaped policies, colonists charted new lands, and poets drew inspiration, all touched by the belief that hidden knowledge could be glimpsed through sacred speech. Even when the oracle's voice faded with the rise of new religions and empires, its resonance endured. Today, the ruins at Delphi stand quiet, but the fascination with prophecy remains. From literature to modern psychology, we are still drawn to the idea that truths lie just beyond our grasp, waiting in symbols, dreams, or riddles. As you imagine the silent stones of Delphi, you sense the echo of a timeless desire, to seek guidance from something greater than ourselves, and to find meaning in the uncertain paths ahead. Imagine the rolling fields of 15th-century Bohemia, where villages stood amid farmland and the horizon stretched open to invading armies. In this setting, the followers of the Hussite movement, peasants, artisans, and townspeople, faced heavily armed knights and crusaders sent to crush their cause. Lacking castles or numbers to match, they turned instead to ingenuity, creating what became known as the wagon fort. Picture sturdy wooden carts, normally used for harvests or trade, reinforced with planks and iron fittings. Chained together in circles or squares, they formed a mobile wall across the landscape. Behind these barriers, defenders crouched with crossbows, pikes, and early handguns, safe from cavalry charges. Imagine the thunder of hooves breaking into confusion as horses balked before the barricade, arrows and shot raining down from within. These formations were not static. Wagons could be unchained and moved quickly, creating new lines or withdrawing to safer ground. In battle after battle, the Hussites used them to repel larger, more powerful armies, turning the open field into a kind of fortress. The tactic combined defense with flexibility, a balance rarely seen at the time. Centuries later, military historians would look back and see in these wagon forts a foreshadowing of armored vehicles and mechanized defenses. What began as farm carts repurposed for survival hinted at the logic of tanks and mobile strongpoints. Standing in those fields today, one might still imagine the creak of wheels, the clang of chains, and the surprising resilience of ordinary people who transformed simple wagons into walls of resistance. Imagine yourself in mid-19th century China, where fields stretch wide but hunger is constant, and discontent simmers beneath the surface of daily life. Into this atmosphere rose the Taiping Rebellion, a movement that promised justice, equality, and salvation, yet spiraled into one of the deadliest uprisings in human history. Led by Hong Xiuquan, who declared himself a brother of Christ, the rebellion gathered millions under banners of faith and reform, challenging the Qing dynasty with both vision and violence. Daily life within the Taiping-controlled regions was reshaped by strict rules. Imagine markets where men and women were segregated, where opium was banned, and where wealth was supposedly shared. Families adjusted to new rhythms of worship and labor, while soldiers marched through villages, their uniforms simple yet their cause immense. For some, the movement offered hope of a more just society. For others, it brought fear and displacement, as war spread like fire across the land. The scale of the rebellion was staggering. Cities fell, millions perished, and the countryside bore scars that would last generations. Imagine walking through a once thriving town, its streets silent, its walls scorched, the memory of conflict lingering like smoke in the air. The Qing dynasty survived, but at great cost, weakened and shaken by the sheer force of the uprising. Even today, the Taiping Rebellion remains a quiet presence in the story of China's modern identity. It foreshadowed future revolutions, exposed the fragility of dynastic rule, and revealed the power of ideas to mobilize entire populations. Imagine again those vast crowds, voices lifted in hymns and battle cries, their hopes and sorrows etched into history. Though the rebellion ended more than a century and a half ago, its shadow stretches forward, a reminder that movements born of faith and desperation can alter the course of nations. Imagine yourself in the expanse of the Sahara, where wind carves shifting dunes and silence stretches wider than the horizon. Across this seeming emptiness, Berber caravans traced invisible lines, routes that stitched North Africa into the fabric of global trade. For centuries, camel trains carried salt, gold, and textiles, their steady pace guided by stars at night and landmarks half buried by sand by day. These paths were not random wanderings but carefully remembered maps, passed down through generations of guides who knew each well, each oasis, each stretch of desert that could mean survival or ruin. Picture the long procession of camels, padded hooves pressing into soft sand, bells tinkling faintly in the dry air. Alongside traveled merchants, scholars, and pilgrims, their conversations weaving languages from Arabic to Berber to Latin. At night, fires flickered against the desert dark, and goods were exchanged beneath constellations that mirrored the shifting lines of trade below. These routes carried not only material wealth but also stories, sciences, and faiths, connecting Timbuktu, Marrakesh, Cairo, and beyond. The Berber networks made the desert less a barrier and more a bridge. Gold from West Africa reached Mediterranean markets, manuscripts flowed southward, and ideas mingled at crossroads where cultures met. Even as empires rose and fell, the routes endured, shifting with political winds yet always maintained by those who knew the desert best. Imagine standing at an oasis where clear water still gathers, feeling the faint echo of countless caravans that once paused there. The Berber desert routes remind us that even the harshest landscapes can become thoroughfares of civilization, carrying the quiet footsteps that linked continents together. Imagine yourself in 17th-century Amsterdam, where the canals glimmer with morning light and the air is filled with the clatter of carts and the smell of tarred ships returning from distant seas. In a bustling hall near the harbor, merchants gather not to trade spices or silks directly, but to buy and sell shares, pieces of paper representing joint ventures in the Dutch East India Company. This was the world's first stock exchange, a space where risk and reward could be divided, where wealth could flow without a single ship setting sail. Daily life for these investors mixed routine and speculation. Imagine a merchant in a woolen coat leaning over a rough wooden table, quill in hand, negotiating the price of shares with a rival. Clerks scratched figures into ledgers, while rumors of storms or successful voyages shifted values from one morning to the next. The rhythm of trade was no longer confined to the marketplace but extended into an abstract realm of promises, dividends, and futures. What began as a practical solution, pooling resources to finance costly voyages, soon evolved into a model of global finance. The principles of joint stock, transferable shares, and open trading created patterns still recognizable today. Banks, corporations, and markets worldwide trace part of their structure back to this hall in Amsterdam, where wealth became something that could be measured, divided, and exchanged beyond physical goods. The legacy of that exchange lingers in every stock ticker, trading floor, and investment portfolio. Though centuries have passed, the foundations remain, a belief that collective investment can fuel ventures larger than any individual could afford, and that risk can be spread across many hands. From the wooden benches of Amsterdam to the skyscrapers of modern cities, the same logic endures, quietly shaping economies across the globe. Imagine yourself in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where the call to prayer drifts across domes and minarets, and soldiers in distinctive uniforms march in steady rhythm. Among them are the Janissaries, an elite corps that for centuries embodied both discipline and power. Unlike ordinary troops, these men were bound directly to the Sultan, their loyalty forged not through birth or noble lineage but through a unique system of recruitment and training that shaped the empire's strength. The Janissary Corps was built on the Devshirme, a levy of Christian boys taken from Balkan villages. Imagine a young boy leaving his family, brought to Istanbul, and placed within the palace schools. There, he would learn Turkish, convert to Islam, and undergo rigorous training in arms and statecraft. The empire transformed these children into soldiers and administrators whose identities were tied entirely to the Ottoman system. For many, this path brought loss, but also opportunity, rising from rural obscurity to positions of influence within one of the world's greatest powers. Daily life as a janissary revolved around discipline. Imagine the clang of swords in practice yards, the solemn rituals of the corps, and the pride of marching in formations that symbolized unity more than individual glory. They were forbidden to marry during service, anchoring their devotion to the state alone. Their presence projected order in the capital and carried Ottoman influence across battlefields from Europe to the Middle East. Over time, however, privilege eroded discipline. Janissaries grew entangled in politics, resisting reform and defending their status. By the 19th century, their once feared corps had become a burden, and the sultans dissolved them in violent suppression. Yet their legacy endures as a reminder of how centralized states harness loyalty, and how institutions built on discipline can shape empires, until they begin to resist the very change needed for survival. Imagine the humid lowlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where thick forests pressed close to rivers and the air carried the calls of birds unseen in the canopy. Here, more than 2,000 years ago, the Olmec civilization carved monuments unlike anything the world had known. Colossal stone heads, each weighing many tons, their features broad and solemn, their presence commanding. Set in plazas and ceremonial centers, they embodied a power now only partly understood. Quarried from distant basalt and transported across miles of jungle and marsh, the heads were feats of both engineering and devotion. Imagine teams of workers hauling stone with ropes and logs, their path lit by torches as they moved through dense terrain. Each head was distinct, perhaps representing rulers or revered ancestors, their helmets suggesting ritual or battle. The faces gaze outward with calm intensity, as if guarding secrets of a culture whose written words have not survived. Though the Olmec civilization faded, their influence rippled across Mesoamerica. Later cultures inherited their art, their symbols, and perhaps their notions of kingship and ritual. The colossal heads remained as silent witnesses, half buried in earth, some hidden until modern archaeologists uncovered them beneath centuries of soil and vegetation. Standing before one today, you sense the mystery that lingers. No text explains their purpose, no record describes their meaning. Yet their scale and craftsmanship speak of a society organized, ambitious, and deeply connected to its spiritual vision. In the stillness of the tropical air, these stone faces remind us how cultures can vanish, yet leave behind images so enduring that they continue to shape imagination across the ages. Imagine yourself in the colonnades of ancient Rome, where marble pillars cast long shadows and the sound of sandals echoes softly against stone. Among senators and merchants walked thinkers who carried not swords but words, stoic philosophers whose teachings shaped how people faced fortune and misfortune alike. Their wisdom was not hidden in temples but woven into the rhythm of daily life, reminding individuals that while they could not control the world, they could govern their response to it. Daily life in Rome was full of uncertainty. Markets rose and fell, politics turned dangerous, and illness or loss could strike at any time. Imagine a merchant sitting by an oil lamp, rereading passages from Seneca, steadying his mind before sleep. Or a soldier stationed far from home, repeating Epictetus's reminder that true freedom lies in mastering oneself, not in conquering others. These quiet practices helped ordinary Romans endure storms without being carried away by fear or anger. The Stoics emphasized reason, balance, and acceptance of what cannot be changed. They urged patience in hardship and humility in success, shaping a way of thinking that felt less like lofty philosophy and more like a tool for living. Imagine Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, writing in his journal during long campaigns, thoughts not of conquest, but of calmness, of kindness, of the fleeting nature of all things. His words still read like a private whisper across centuries. Even today, Stoicism lingers in unexpected places. Modern therapy borrows its principles for cognitive resilience, encouraging people to question unhelpful thoughts and focus on what lies within their control. Leaders, athletes, and ordinary people alike still turn to these teachings when seeking clarity in chaos. Imagine again those Roman streets, the voices of Stoics mingling with the bustle, their lessons not lost to time but alive each time someone steadies themselves with a thought. You cannot choose events, but you can choose your response. Imagine yourself on the wide Mongolian steppe in the 13th century, where endless grasslands rolled beneath the hooves of cavalry. From this open land rose an empire that stretched farther than any before it, binding together peoples as different as Persians, Chinese, and Russians. At its core was an unexpected principle: religious tolerance. Genghis Khan and his successors recognized that to govern such diversity, one could not impose a single faith. Instead, shamans, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and others were permitted to practice freely, their rituals and customs carried on even under Mongol rule. Picture a bustling city on the Silk Road, where a mosque's call to prayer rose alongside the toll of church bells and the chanting of Buddhist monks. In Mongol courts, priests from multiple traditions debated philosophy, translated texts, and blessed rulers in turn. Rather than crush difference, the empire wove it into its administration, granting exemptions to clergy, inviting scholars, and using tolerance as a tool of stability. This policy was not born of modern ideals but of pragmatism. The Mongols valued loyalty over belief, tribute over doctrine. Yet the result was a rare moment in medieval history when pluralism flourished across vast distances. Imagine yourself traveling through the empire, hearing many tongues and seeing many symbols of faith coexisting under one authority. Though the empire itself eventually fractured, its example endures, reminding us that tolerance can bind societies as effectively as conquest. The Mongol approach foreshadowed the pluralistic visions of later nations, a quiet lesson from horse lords whose power was matched by their willingness to let many gods share the same sky. Imagine yourself wandering the narrow alleys of Venice in the late Middle Ages, where the salty lagoon air mingles with the sharp scent of burning furnaces. Behind guarded doors on the island of Murano, glassmakers labored over glowing crucibles, their faces lit by the orange glow of molten silica. The hiss of bellows, the clink of metal tools, and the soft exhalation of glass being blown into shape filled the workshops. These artisans were sworn to secrecy, their skills so prized that leaving Venice with the knowledge of their craft could mean exile, or worse. Daily life for a Murano glassmaker followed a strict rhythm. At dawn, the furnaces were stoked, and by mid-morning, the heat inside the workshop was nearly unbearable. Imagine the craftsman's steady breath as he turned a glowing bubble of glass on an iron pipe, coaxing it into a goblet, a windowpane, or a delicate bead. Apprentices fetched raw materials, ground minerals into powders for color, and swept the floor of shards, while masters experimented with recipes for clarity, strength, and brilliance. Their inventions included crystal-clear glass, intricate millefiori patterns, and mirrors so polished they seemed almost magical. The secrecy surrounding these techniques ensured Venice's dominance. Glass objects traveled across Europe, symbols of wealth and refinement, carried on ships that also spread Venetian influence. Over time, some secrets slipped out, through trade, imitation, or defection, and glassmaking centers arose in other parts of the world. Yet the aura of Murano remained, its name synonymous with both artistry and innovation. The legacy of these guarded workshops endures in every window, lens, and vessel that shapes modern life. From microscopes to telescopes, from chandeliers to skyscraper panes, the art and science of glass trace their lineage back to those hidden Venetian furnaces. What began as closely guarded craft became a foundation for both beauty and discovery, reflecting light across centuries. Imagine yourself in a quiet courtyard at dusk, where lanterns flicker and the air is scented with rose water and incense. A circle of men in long white robes begins to turn, slowly at first, then with steady rhythm. Their arms extend, one hand raised to the sky, the other lowered toward the earth, as if channeling something greater through the act of movement. These are Sufi mystics, remembered as whirling dervishes, whose rituals were more than performance. They were meditations on love, unity, and the dissolving of the self into the divine. Daily life among Sufis was often humble. Imagine scholars copying poems by lamplight, travelers sharing bread in small lodges, and teachers guiding disciples in chants that echoed like steady heartbeats. They sought not power but closeness to God, emphasizing compassion, humility, and the recognition that all creation is bound together. In a world often fractured by political strife, their teachings whispered of unity, that the walls between faiths and peoples could soften through love. Figures like Rumi expressed these truths in verse, but countless others lived them quietly, without fame, moving from town to town as teachers, healers, and poets. Their ideas spread along trade routes, blending into local cultures, carrying with them a vision of the divine that was intimate rather than distant. Though some authorities dismissed or even persecuted them, the mystics' influence endured. You can hear their echoes in movements for peace, in songs of tolerance, and in the quiet conviction that love is a form of knowledge as powerful as reason. Standing in that courtyard, listening to the turn of robes and the soft music of flutes, you might sense the depth of their message, that in letting go of the self, one can touch the infinite, and in seeing the divine in others, one can find true unity. Imagine England in the late 14th century, its villages bound by long hours of toil in fields of barley and wheat. The Black Death had thinned the population, and yet taxes rose, demanding more from those who already carried heavy burdens. Against this backdrop of hardship, anger gathered quietly among peasants, craftsmen, and laborers until, in 1381, it spilled into open revolt. It began with resistance to a poll tax, but soon became something larger, a call for fair wages, the reduction of feudal obligations, and a voice in how the kingdom was governed. Imagine crowds moving toward London, their banners lifted, their chants rising like waves over the countryside. At their side walked figures like Wat Tyler and the priest John Ball, who preached that all people were born equal, that lords and peasants alike shared the same human worth. For a brief moment, it seemed change was possible. The rebels entered London, demanding reforms directly from the young King Richard II. Promises were spoken, charters drafted, and the air must have felt thick with possibility. Yet hope proved fragile. Tyler was killed in a sudden clash, and the king's pledges were quickly withdrawn. Retribution followed, harsh and swift, scattering the movement back into silence. Still, the memory of the peasants' revolt endured. Though crushed, it revealed the power of collective action and foreshadowed struggles for equality that would resurface in later centuries. Imagine those fields once more, where laborers bent to their work under gray skies, carrying with them not just tools but the quiet knowledge that even the lowliest voices could rise together and shake the foundations of a kingdom. Imagine yourself on a quiet beach in the Pacific in the 1970s, where a group of people gather around the frame of a canoe taking shape under the sun. For centuries, the great tradition of Polynesian voyaging had been nearly forgotten, replaced by engines, charts, and Western navigation. Yet here, with the scent of freshly cut wood in the air and the rhythm of hands tying lashings, a revival was beginning. The canoe would sail not just across water, but across time, restoring knowledge thought to be lost. Daily life for these revivalists meant listening to elders, studying fragments of oral tradition, and relearning the art of wayfinding without compasses or maps. Imagine them under starlit skies, tracing constellations with their fingers, reading the swell of the ocean, and watching the flight of seabirds. Each night became both classroom and ceremony, as they pieced together methods their ancestors had used to cross thousands of miles of open sea. The launch of canoes like Klee became more than voyages, they were acts of identity. When the sails caught the wind, entire communities gathered, the air filled with chants and the beating of drums, the ocean carrying both vessel and memory forward. These journeys proved what had long been doubted, that Polynesian navigators had crossed vast oceans with deliberate skill, guided by stars and waves rather than chance. Today, the voyaging revival continues, shaping cultural pride and environmental awareness across the Pacific. Imagine standing on the deck of one of these canoes as dawn breaks, the horizon painted in soft light. You hear the steady voice of a navigator calling out star paths, his words blending ancient memory with present determination. The canoe moves forward, carrying not only its crew but the spirit of a people reclaiming their place on the ocean and in history. Imagine yourself in 16th-century Istanbul, where narrow streets opened into lively courtyards scented with roasted beans and wood smoke. Here, the first Ottoman coffeehouses emerged, spaces where bitter, dark coffee was served slowly in small cups, its warmth lingering as conversations stretched into the night. Unlike palaces or mosques, these houses were open to many. Merchants, poets, scholars, and travelers sat side by side, sharing news, debating ideas, and reciting verses. The air was thick not only with aroma but with the hum of voices, a rhythm of exchange that gave coffee houses their reputation as schools of the wise. Picture a storyteller holding the attention of a circle, weaving tales of distant lands. Nearby, two traders negotiated contracts, while in the corner, a group discussed politics with cautious subtlety. Coffee itself was part of the allure. Its stimulating effect allowed gatherings to last longer, thoughts to sharpen, and ideas to spread more quickly. Authorities, uneasy with the power of such spaces, sometimes banned the drink or closed the houses, yet they always returned, too deeply woven into daily life to vanish. From Istanbul, the custom spread across the empire and into Europe, where cafés became centers of Enlightenment discussion. The legacy is still visible today whenever a café becomes a place for reading, writing, or debate. Imagine sitting with a steaming cup in hand, hearing the distant echo of those Ottoman voices, their conversations flowing like the coffee poured from copper pots. The coffeehouse reminds us that culture often changes not only in palaces or battlefields, but in simple shared spaces, where the warmth of drink and dialogue reshapes the course of thought. Imagine yourself in the hills of central Italy more than 2,000 years ago, where smoke from hearth fires drifts above clustered villages and the sound of bronze tools rings through the air. This is the world of the Etruscans, a people whose culture flourished before Rome's rise and whose influence lingers quietly in traditions we still recognize. Their tombs were carved like houses, complete with painted walls showing feasts and music, a reflection of how deeply they valued the continuity between life and death. The faint scent of burning incense and the murmur of ritual chants would have filled these spaces, linking the living to ancestors in ways both solemn and familiar. Daily life carried rhythms of artistry and ceremony. Imagine workshops where artisans hammered bronze mirrors, sculpted terracotta figures, and painted pottery in vivid patterns. Banquets were not merely meals but communal rituals, with reclining men and women sharing food and song in settings that prefigured Roman feasting halls. Priests studied the flight of birds or the entrails of animals, believing the gods spoke through signs in nature. The Etruscans' careful attention to ritual order shaped the Roman fascination with augury and sacrifice, embedding their worldview deep into future traditions. Much of their legacy lives on through Rome, which absorbed Etruscan practices into its own identity. The curved arch, a hallmark of architecture, was first an Etruscan innovation. The Roman toga and symbols of authority, like the fasces, bundled rods that later echoed in modern politics, also trace back to them. Even gladiatorial games, though transformed by Rome into grand spectacles, likely began as Etruscan funeral rites. Though their language faded and their names were absorbed, the Etruscans remain present in the structures, rituals, and symbols of Western culture. Their story is a reminder that civilizations often live on not in memory alone, but in the quiet persistence of practices woven into daily life. Imagine yourself walking through the rose-red cliffs of Petra, where canyons twist into hidden passageways and carved facades glow in the desert light. To the casual eye, this ancient Nabatean city seems a monument of stone, but its true genius lay in something less visible: water. In one of the driest regions of the Near East, the Nabateans mastered the art of capturing, storing, and channeling rainfall, turning barren ground into a flourishing center of life and trade. Daily life here would have been shaped by this unseen network. Imagine cisterns cut deep into rock, channels guiding rainwater from distant hills, and terracotta pipes carrying it silently into the city. At the heart of Petra, fountains and gardens bloomed, luxuries sustained by precision engineering. Traders resting with their caravans of incense and spices could find shade and cool water, marveling at how a desert stronghold rivaled the wealth of great cities along the Mediterranean. The system was not only practical but sustainable. Every drop was used with care, directed to where it was most needed. Floods, common in desert wadis, were diverted through dams and channels, while underground reservoirs preserved supplies for dry months. The result was a city that thrived for centuries, even as others struggled with scarcity. Eventually, shifting trade routes and earthquakes led to Petra's decline, leaving its waterworks buried in silence. Yet when archaeologists uncovered channels carved into cliff walls and cisterns still holding traces of use, they revealed lessons that feel strikingly modern. The Nabateans remind us that survival in harsh landscapes depends not only on strength, but on careful design, balance, and respect for resources. In their hidden channels, you can still sense the quiet wisdom of a people who made the desert bloom. Imagine the stone monasteries of medieval Armenia, perched on cliffs above winding rivers, their walls darkened by centuries of smoke from oil lamps. Inside, in quiet chambers where the air smelled of parchment and ink, monks worked patiently at wooden desks. These scriptoria became sanctuaries of language and memory, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost to war, invasion, or neglect. By candlelight, scribes copied religious manuscripts, histories, and philosophical works. Their tools were simple: reed pens, inks mixed from local minerals, parchment prepared with care, yet the results were lasting treasures. Imagine the steady scratch of pen across vellum, the rhythm of prayer whispered between lines, and the careful illuminations of birds, vines, and geometric borders that framed the words. Each page was both an act of devotion and an anchor for culture. These scriptoria did more than record scripture. They preserved fragments of Greek philosophy, translations of medical treatises, and chronicles of Armenian kings and battles. When foreign armies swept through, burning villages and scattering communities, the monasteries often endured as strongholds, carrying forward a continuity of thought. In times when survival was uncertain, the act of copying words itself became resistance. Today, many of these manuscripts remain in libraries and churches, their pages fragile but their message enduring. They remind us that resilience is not only in arms or fortifications, but in ink carried across centuries. Imagine opening one of these books, the parchment soft with age, and feeling how the hands of monks long gone still whisper through every line, preserving a culture's voice against the silence of time.